You're about to discover the complete, unfiltered story of the most important trade route in human history. And trust me, it's nothing like what you learned in school. We're going to journey across 4,000 miles of desert, mountains, and ancient cities, uncovering how the Silk Road shaped everything from the clothes you wear to the religion you might follow, from the spices in your kitchen to the very concept of globalization. We'll witness brutal conquests, incredible fortunes, deadly betrayals, and discover why this ancient highway ultimately collapsed and what that means for our connected world today. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand how a network of desert paths became the backbone of human civilization and why the lessons of the Silk Road are more relevant now than ever before. Though before we dive into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Please introduce yourself in the comments, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're on to building a global community here. Thank you once more for joining me today, so without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The world before silk, isolation and the cradle of civilizations. Before the roads opened, the world existed in fragments. Around 200 BCE, vast empires rose across Eurasia, each unaware of the other's grandeur. The Mediterranean world was being reshaped by the expanding Roman Republic, where legions marched under eagles and senators debated in marble forums. Eastward beyond comprehension lay the Han Dynasty, where emperors ruled from Chang'an over millions of subjects who had never heard of Rome. Between them stretched territories that seemed endless, dangerous, unknowable. Each civilization developed in profound isolation. The Romans knew vaguely of peoples they called Saras, silk makers somewhere beyond the horizon. The Chinese understood their Middle Kingdom as the center of all civilization, surrounded by barbarians in every direction. Neither could have imagined the complexity of what lay between them. Mountain ranges as tall as the sky, deserts that consumed armies, steppes where horsemen lived entire lives without seeing a city. The Parthian Empire controlled Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, heir to ancient Persian traditions. Their cavalry was legendary, their archery unmatched. They sat astride the narrow corridors where east might meet west, though no one yet understood this geography. North of all these empires, the steppes belonged to confederations of nomadic peoples. The Xiongnu dominated the grasslands, masters of horsemanship and warfare. Han China paid them tribute in silk, gold, and grain, purchasing temporary peace along their northern frontier. The relationship was unstable, humiliating for the Chinese court. Trade existed, but it was fragmentary, passing through countless middlemen. Silk reached Rome, though Romans believed it grew on trees. Lapis lazuli from distant mountains adorned Mediterranean jewelry, its source unknown to those who wore it. These goods traveled through relay systems, changing hands dozens of times. No merchant made the full journey. No one needed to, because no one conceived of such a journey as possible. The empires had different needs, different surpluses. Rome possessed gold and silver in abundance, Mediterranean wine, and glasswork of extraordinary quality. The Han controlled silk production, a secret they guarded carefully. Their bronzes and lacquerware represented centuries of refinement. Iron tools from Han forges surpassed anything produced elsewhere. The Parthians possessed horses bred for war, dyes extracted from sea snails, and control over the few passes through their territories. But isolation meant vulnerability. The Han faced constant pressure from the Xiongnu. Every autumn, as grass grew scarce on the steppes, raids intensified. Villages burned. Captives were taken. The tribute payments grew heavier each year, draining the imperial treasury. Emperor Wu ascended the throne in 141 BCE with ambitions that would reshape the world. Young, energetic, he refused to accept the old arrangements. He sought military solutions, strategic alliances, any advantage that might break the cycle of raids and tribute. In 139 BCE, intelligence reached the imperial court. A people called the Yuezhi, driven from their homeland by the Xiongnu decades earlier, now dwelled somewhere far to the west. They harbored deep resentment toward the Xiongnu, who had taken their lands and created drinking vessels from their king's skull. Here was the possibility Emperor Wu needed, an alliance that could attack the Xiongnu from two directions simultaneously. But the Yuezhi, lived beyond the empire's borders, beyond the Xiongnu's territory, beyond any maps the Chinese possessed. The emperor needed an envoy willing to undertake an impossible journey, someone brave enough to cross Xiongnu lands, resourceful enough to survive whatever lay beyond, and loyal enough to return with the information China required. The man who volunteered would change history, though he could not have known it. His name was Zhang Qian, a low-ranking court official. His journey would take 13 years. It would fail in its immediate objective, but it would open the emperor's eyes to a world far larger, far richer, far more complex than anyone in Chang'an had imagined. The routes were about to be discovered. The great exchange was about to begin. Zhang Qian's Odyssey, the emperor's envoy, and the discovery of the West. Zhang Qian departed Chang'an in 139 BCE with approximately 100 men. Among them was a guide named Ganfu, a Xiongnu who knew the northern territories. They carried gifts for the Yuezhi, credentials from Emperor Wu, and supplies for a journey of unknown duration. No one in the party understood how far they would travel or what they would find. The mission seemed straightforward: cross Xiongnu territory, locate the Yuezhi, forge an alliance, return with confirmation. But the Xiongnu controlled the only viable routes westward. Capture came swiftly. Xiongnu cavalry intercepted the expedition before it had traveled far beyond Han borders. The Shanyu, the Xiongnu leader, immediately understood the threat. A Han envoy seeking allies to the west could not be permitted to succeed. But the Xiongnu did not execute Zhang Qian. Instead, they detained him, placed him under surveillance, tried to make him forget his mission. They gave him a Xiongnu wife, hoping marriage and family would dissolve his loyalty to the distant emperor. Zhang Qian lived among the Xiongnu for 10 years. During this decade, he learned their language, their customs, their geography. He observed their horse breeding techniques, their archery, their seasonal migrations. He had a son with his Xiongnu wife. To his captors, he appeared settled, no longer dangerous. But according to the historian Sima Qian, who recorded these events, Zhang Qian never abandoned his purpose. He waited. He planned. When vigilance finally relaxed around 129 BCE, he and Ganfu escaped. They fled westward, the only direction that made sense. Eastward led back to China through hostile territory. South and north offered nothing but more steppe. West promised the unknown, but also the Yuezhi. The journey tested them immediately. They crossed through the territory of small kingdoms in the Tarim Basin, oasis cities that had developed independent cultures. Zhang Qian noted everything: the crops they grew, the goods they traded, the languages they spoke, their relations with neighboring powers. The landscape transformed as they traveled. The grasslands gave way to desert, then to mountain foothills. They entered the region the Chinese would call the Western regions, a vast territory of extraordinary diversity. Zhang Qian encountered peoples who cultivated grapes and made wine, crops unknown in China. He saw irrigation systems that sustained agriculture in arid lands. The cities impressed him with their sophistication. The most significant discovery came in the kingdom of Daiwan in the Fergana Valley. Here, Zhang Qian observed horses unlike any bred in China. Tall, powerful, with exceptional endurance, these animals were referred to as heavenly horses in later Chinese accounts. Some reports claim they sweated blood, probably due to a parasitic infection, but the description captured Chinese imagination. These horses could transform Han cavalry, Zhang Qian realized. They represented a strategic advantage the emperor would desire desperately. Beyond Fergana, the journey continued to Bactria, where Alexander's conquests had left Greek cultural influences 2 centuries earlier. The Greco-Bactrian culture fascinated Zhang Qian. Here were people who blended Hellenistic and Central Asian traditions, who minted coins with Greek inscriptions, who built cities following Greek architectural principles. He was witnessing the western edge of a world system he was only beginning to understand. Finally, Zhang Qian reached the Yuezhi. They had settled in the region north of the Hindu Kush after their expulsion by the Xiongnu, establishing a new homeland. But the alliance Emperor Wu desired proved impossible. The Yuezhi had no interest in returning east to fight the Xiongnu. They had found prosperity in their new territories. Warfare with distant enemies offered them nothing. Zhang Qian spent a year among them, attempting persuasion, but they remained unmoved. His primary mission had failed. Yet the journey had already succeeded in ways Zhang Qian was beginning to grasp. He had discovered sophisticated kingdoms with developed economies. He had mapped routes through territories no Chinese official had seen. He had learned of goods, crops, and technologies unknown in China. Perhaps most importantly, he had discovered that the world was vastly larger and more interconnected than anyone in Chang'an understood. The return journey brought fresh disaster. Zhang Qian chose a southern route, hoping to avoid Xiongnu territory. Instead, he passed through lands controlled by other nomadic groups. Once again, he was captured. This time, detention lasted only about a year before political upheaval among his captors created an opportunity. Zhang Qian, his wife, Ganfu, and perhaps a few others escaped. They reached Han territory in 126 BCE, 13 years after their departure. Of the 100 men who had set out, only Zhang Qian and Ganfu returned. The mission had failed in its stated objective. No alliance materialized. No coordinated attack on the Xiongnu occurred. But Zhang Qian carried something more valuable than military agreements: knowledge. He had seen distant kingdoms with populations living in cities, like cultivating the land, trading extensively. He had discovered the Parthian Empire, which controlled crucial territories between Central Asia and the Mediterranean. He had learned of India to the south, another great civilization the Chinese knew almost nothing about. Emperor Wu received Zhang Qian's report with intense interest. The envoy described kingdoms full of rare things, with populations living in fixed abodes and given to occupations somewhat identical with those of the Chinese people, but with weak armies, and placing great value on the rich produce of China, according to later historical records. The strategic implications were profound. The economic possibilities were immense. The western regions were not empty wasteland, but a landscape of opportunities. Zhang Qian was rewarded for his intelligence, though his capture had prevented military success. He participated in subsequent campaigns against the Xiongnu, serving with distinction. In 119 BCE, the emperor sent him on a second mission, this time to the Wusun people who dwelled north of the Tarim Basin. Again, a military alliance proved elusive, but Zhang Qian sent deputies from this mission further west, extending Chinese knowledge even deeper into Central Asia. These envoys reached Parthia, Bactria, and other distant regions, gathering information that filled gaps in Zhang Qian's own observations. The historian Sima Qian, writing within decades of these events, understood their significance. He described Zhang Qian as having opened up or hollowed out the road to the western regions. The metaphor suggested removing obstacles, creating pathways where none had existed. Zhang Qian died around 114 BCE, but his legacy was already assured. Following his reports, Emperor Wu dispatched numerous embassies westward. Historical records indicate that between 5 and 10 caravans departed for the western regions annually in the years following Zhang Qian's return. These missions were not primarily military. They were diplomatic and commercial. China sought horses from Fergana, information about western kingdoms, and routes that could bypass Xiongnu control. The western regions offered markets for silk, access to new crops like alfalfa for horse fodder, and political relationships that could stabilize the frontier. A network was forming, link by link, based on the knowledge Zhang Qian had gathered during 13 years of travel and captivity. What Zhang Qian had discovered was the possibility of connection. The Silk Road did not yet exist as an organized trade route, but its basic architecture was now visible to Chinese strategists. Zhang Qian had proven that determined travelers could reach distant kingdoms, that these kingdoms desired Chinese goods, and that the journey, though dangerous, was survivable. The world was no longer fragmented into isolated pieces. It was a network waiting to be activated, and Zhang Qian had drawn the first crude map. The routes take shape: caravans, oases, and the Taklamakan Desert. The road westward from China was not a road. It was a series of desperate gambles separated by oases. The Taklamakan Desert dominated the western regions, a sea of sand stretching nearly 1,000 kilometers east to west, 600 kilometers north to south. Its name, in the Turkic languages of the region, may mean "go in and you won't come out." The name was accurate. Summer temperatures reached 50 degrees. Winter cold descended to -20. Water was absent. Food was impossible. The desert tolerated no mistakes. But the desert could not be avoided. It stood between China and the western kingdoms Zhang Qian had described. It blocked access to the Fergana horses, the Bactrian trade goods, the routes toward Parthia, and beyond. The Han Dynasty wanted what lay beyond the Taklamakan. Merchants began to want it too, as news of Zhang Qian's discoveries spread. So the question became not whether to cross the desert, but how. The answer was detouring around it. Two primary routes emerged, dictated by geography and the placement of water sources. The northern route followed the Tian Shan mountain range's southern foothills, connecting oasis cities that drew water from snowmelt. Travelers moved from Dunhuang through Hami, then along a chain of settlements to Kashgar at the desert's western edge. The journey took months, but water was relatively predictable. The southern route traced the edge where the Taklamakan met the Kunlun Mountains. This path connected oases sustained by rivers flowing north from the high peaks before disappearing into the sand. Travelers went from Dunhuang southward to Miran, then westward through Khotan and Yarkand before reaching Kashgar. This route was longer, sometimes more dangerous, but it accessed different kingdoms and trade goods. Both routes depended entirely on the oasis cities. These settlements were extraordinary achievements of adaptation. Their populations had learned to manage scarce water with sophisticated irrigation systems, channeling every drop from seasonal rivers to cultivate crops and sustain populations. Without them, crossing the Taklamakan was simply impossible. With them, the crossing became merely extremely difficult. The oasis cities developed distinct characters, influenced by their positions and the various powers that claimed them. Khotan, on the southern route, emerged as a major center. Its population spoke an Indo-European language related to Sanskrit, maintained Buddhist monasteries, and controlled sources of jade that Chinese craftsmen prized. The kingdom maintained relative independence for centuries, playing larger powers against each other. Kucha, on the northern route, developed similar importance. Its location made it a hub where east-west trade intersected with routes running north to the steppes. The cities were more than way stations. They were manufacturing centers, producing goods that fed into the trade network. Khotan's jade and carpets, Kucha's metalwork, Kashgar's leather goods, these products had value independent of the through trade. The cities also served as information clearinghouses, where merchants exchanged knowledge about conditions ahead, prices in distant markets, political situations that might affect travel. But the cities could not eliminate the desert itself. Between oases lay stretches of absolute desolation. Water ran out, landmarks vanished in sandstorms, travelers lost their way and perished. Bandits waited at narrow passages, knowing caravans had no alternative routes. The skeleton of the Silk Road was forming, but the journey remained lethal. The solution to desert crossing came from an unexpected source: the Bactrian camel. These animals, with two humps and thick fur, were native to Central Asia. They possessed remarkable abilities that made trans-desert commerce possible. A Bactrian camel could carry 200 kilograms for weeks. It could survive without water for days, drawing on fat reserves in its humps. Most crucially, it could navigate in sandstorms and sense water sources humans could not detect. Zhang Qian had observed these animals during his travels. Following his reports, the Han began importing them, breeding them, studying their capabilities. Merchants organized caravans around them. A typical caravan might include dozens of camels moving slowly but reliably between water sources. The camel's endurance determined the possible routes. If a camel could make the journey between two oases, so could a caravan. If the distance exceeded camel endurance, that route was impossible. The caravans developed elaborate organization. Experienced guides who knew every water source and landmark led the expeditions. Guards protected against bandits, though they could do little against sandstorms or extreme weather. Merchants negotiated prices and access in the oasis cities, while camel handlers managed the animals that made everything possible. Some caravans were small, 5 or 6 merchants traveling together for safety. Others involved hundreds of animals and dozens of people, massive undertakings requiring substantial investment. Travel timing became crucial. Summer heat made desert crossing impossible. Winter cold was equally deadly. Spring and autumn offered windows when temperatures were survivable, and seasonal rivers provided water. Caravans clustered during these periods, racing to complete their journeys before conditions deteriorated. The oasis cities saw populations fluctuate dramatically as caravans arrived, stayed to rest and resupply, then departed. The journey from Chang'an to Kashgar required approximately 3 to 4 months under ideal conditions. Longer if weather turned bad, if bandits struck, if animals died or goods were lost. Merchants rarely completed the entire journey themselves. Instead, goods passed through the relay system Zhang Qian had observed. Chinese merchants might travel only as far as Dunhuang, selling to Central Asian traders who would carry goods further west. Those traders might reach Kashgar before selling to Parthian merchants who would continue toward the Mediterranean. This relay system meant knowledge remained fragmented. Few individuals understood the entire route. Each segment had its specialists who knew their territory intimately but had never seen the endpoints. This fragmentation would later prove advantageous for middlemen who could control information and maintain profit margins. But in these early years, it simply reflected the practical limits of travel. The Han Dynasty recognized that trade routes needed military protection. Zhang Qian's reports had emphasized this point. In the decades following his return, Han armies pushed westward, establishing military presence in the Hexi Corridor, the crucial gateway between China proper and the western regions. The Great Wall was extended westward, its final sections reaching toward Dunhuang, creating a protected corridor through which caravans could begin their journeys. Garrison posts were established at strategic locations, staffed with soldiers who also cultivated land to sustain themselves. These posts served multiple functions: military defense, signal stations to warn of approaching threats, and refuges where caravans could find protection. The archaeological record preserves watchtowers, barracks, and defensive walls, marking this infrastructure of empire and commerce. The Han government understood that trade required security, and security required military investment, but government control extended only so far. Beyond the westernmost Han posts, travelers relied on local protection. Some oasis kingdoms maintained their own security forces. Others charged fees to caravans in exchange for safe passage. In many areas, no protection existed at all. Merchants armed themselves, hired guards, and accepted risk as inherent to their profession. The profits from successful journeys had to compensate for losses from failed ones. Not everyone traveled for commerce. Buddhist missionaries began using these routes, carrying their religion eastward. Political envoys followed the path Zhang Qian had blazed, carrying diplomatic correspondence between distant courts. Adventurers traveled out of curiosity. Military deserters fled along these roads, seeking anonymity in distant cities. The routes served diverse purposes, though commerce remained primary. The goods moving along these paths were carefully selected. Only high-value items justified the cost and risk of desert crossing. Silk topped the list. Chinese silk production remained a monopoly, and Western markets would pay extraordinary prices. Jade from Khotan, precious stones from various sources, certain spices, metalwork, specialized textiles, these were the items that made the journey worthwhile. Bulk goods, heavy materials, perishables, these remained local or regional products. The Silk Road was a luxury trade route, not a highway for everyday commerce. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the route system had stabilized. Merchants understood the basic geography, the seasonal patterns, the oasis cities, and their relationships. The Taklamakan remained terrifying, but it was no longer unknown. Caravans departed regularly from Chinese posts, disappeared into the desert, and usually re-emerged at the western edge, having survived another crossing. The road was taking shape, one successful journey at a time. The desert had not been tamed, could never be tamed. But it could be crossed, and crossing it generated profits that justified every risk. The Parthian middlemen, masters of the silk trade. The Parthian Empire understood its geographical advantage better than any power along the emerging trade routes. Rising from the region the Persians had once called Parthava, the Arsacid dynasty had built an empire spanning from Mesopotamia to the edges of Central Asia by 247 BCE. They controlled the crucial bottleneck, where routes from the east met roads leading to the Mediterranean. No goods traveling from China to Rome could avoid Parthian territory. No merchant could circumvent their customs posts. This position made them wealthy beyond measure, and they guarded their advantage jealously. The Parthians inherited sophisticated systems from their predecessors. The Achaemenid Persians had built roads centuries earlier, maintained post stations, and developed administrative infrastructure. The Seleucid Greeks, who followed Alexander's conquests, had added urban centers, Greek-style marketplaces, and commercial practices blending east and west. When the Parthians expelled the Seleucids from Iran around 140 BCE, they absorbed these systems and improved them. Parthian emperors styled themselves King of Kings, claiming Persian heritage while maintaining pragmatic openness to Greek culture. Their capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River became one of the great commercial centers of the ancient world. Caravans arriving from Central Asia found established markets, currency exchange, warehouses, and merchant communities speaking dozens of languages. Parthian merchants specialized in reselling and transporting goods. They bought Central Asian and Chinese products, marked up prices substantially, and sold them to traders heading toward Roman territories. They purchased Mediterranean goods and moved them eastward, again extracting profits from their middleman position. The Parthians recognized that information asymmetry protected their profits. If Chinese and Roman merchants could trade directly, Parthian markups would disappear. Therefore, the Parthians systematically discouraged direct contact between East and West. They spread misleading information about distances, dangers, and the nature of foreign kingdoms. When Roman merchants inquired about silk sources, Parthians claimed it grew on trees, harvested by distant peoples whose location shifted with each telling. When Chinese envoys asked about the Mediterranean, Parthians emphasized dangers, distances, impassable territories. The most famous example of this information control involved a Chinese envoy named Gan Ying. Around 97 CE, the Han Dynasty sent him westward with instructions to reach the Roman Empire, which the Chinese called Da Qin. Gan Ying traveled successfully through Central Asia and reached the Parthian territories bordering the Mediterranean. Here, he sought passage to Roman lands, possibly attempting to cross by sea. But Parthian officials discouraged him, describing the sea voyage as lasting months or years, subject to storms and strange hazards. The descriptions were exaggerated, deliberately designed to prevent direct Chinese-Roman contact. Gan Ying turned back, never reaching Rome. The Parthian information blockade had succeeded. This strategy was not merely deceptive, it was economically rational. Parthian prosperity depended on maintaining their position as essential intermediaries. Archaeological evidence from Parthian sites reveals extraordinary wealth. Silver vessels decorated with Hellenistic motifs, luxury goods from across the known world, architectural grandeur rivaling any contemporary power, all financed by trade. Cities like Palmyra and Dura Europos, on the western edges of Parthian influence, thrived as commercial centers where goods changed hands and cultures mixed. The Parthian silk trade with Rome became legendary. Romans developed an insatiable appetite for silk following their first encounter with it, probably during the disastrous Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. Parthian forces under General Surena had displayed enormous silk banners that dazzled Roman soldiers. Following this battle, silk became the ultimate luxury in Rome. Women wore it to display wealth and status. Men criticized its expense and supposed decadence, but purchased it nonetheless. Pliny the Elder famously calculated that silk drained 100 million sesterces annually from Roman coffers, wealth that ultimately enriched Parthian merchants and Chinese producers. But Parthian control was never absolute. Sea routes offered potential alternatives. By the 1st century CE, sailors had mastered monsoons, allowing direct voyages across the Indian Ocean between India and the Red Sea. Roman merchants established ports on Egypt's Red Sea coast, where they could access maritime trade networks that bypassed Parthian territory. Ships carried Chinese silk that had traveled through India, avoiding Parthian markups entirely. This maritime competition forced the Parthians to remain somewhat competitive. They could not charge unlimited prices without driving commerce to sea routes. They maintained roads, provided security against bandits, and ensured their territories remained traversable. Caravan cities within Parthian territory competed to attract trade, offering amenities and services. The middleman position was lucrative but required constant management. Parthian culture itself became a blend reflecting their commercial role. Their art synthesized Greek, Persian, and Central Asian elements. Their religion mixed Zoroastrian traditions with tolerance for Greek, Buddhist, and other practices. Multiple languages circulated in their cities: Parthian, Greek, Aramaic, and others. This cultural flexibility facilitated trade. Merchants from anywhere could find familiar elements in Parthian territories, communities of their own people, temples for their gods, and markets that understood their needs. The Parthians also faced continuous military pressures that shaped their commercial policies. Rome, expanding eastward, repeatedly clashed with Parthia over control of Armenia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. These wars disrupted trade periodically, but never permanently. After each conflict, commerce resumed because both sides needed it. Roman gold flowed east to purchase silk and spices. Parthian territories needed Roman currency for internal circulation. War was expensive, but the profits from trade helped finance military expenditures. To the east, Parthian relations with the Kushan Empire were generally more cooperative. The Kushans controlled much of Central Asia and northwestern India by the 1st century CE, dominating the routes that fed goods to Parthian territories. Kushan merchants, often Sogdians specializing in long-distance trade, brought silk, precious stones, and Buddhist monks into Parthian lands. Parthians facilitated their passage westward, profiting at each transaction but generally maintaining peaceful relations. Both empires benefited from stable, functioning trade routes. The Parthian economic system developed sophisticated financial practices. Money changers operated in every major city, converting between Roman denarii, Parthian drachms, and the various currencies of Central Asian kingdoms. Credit arrangements allowed merchants to finance caravans without carrying enormous quantities of precious metal. Partnerships and joint ventures distributed risk. The archaeological record preserves commercial documents, contracts, and receipts written in multiple languages and scripts, evidence of a mature commercial culture. Silk moved through Parthian territories in vast quantities. Chinese historical sources indicate that following Zhang Qian's initial journeys, Han embassies to the western regions numbered between 5 and 10 annually, with party sizes ranging from hundreds to a few dozen members. These were official missions, but they carried substantial quantities of silk as diplomatic gifts and trading goods. Private merchants conducted additional trade, though documentation is scarcer. By the 1st century CE, silk was flowing westward in quantities that made it available in Roman markets, expensive but obtainable. The Parthians also exported their own products. Their metalwork, especially silver vessels featuring elaborate designs, found markets across Asia. Certain dyes, especially purple extracted from sea snails, commanded high prices. Dates, wines, perfumes, various regional products supplemented the transit trade. But the real profits came from facilitating other people's commerce, taxing it, marking it up, and controlling the routes it traveled. This middleman prosperity created vulnerability. The Parthian Empire never achieved the centralized control of Rome or Han China. Regional governors maintained considerable autonomy. Succession conflicts repeatedly weakened central authority. These internal divisions occasionally disrupted trade as competing factions fought for control of commercial centers. But the fundamentally decentralized structure also provided flexibility. When central authority weakened, local cities and merchant communities often maintained commercial operations independently. By the end of the 2nd century CE, Parthian power was declining. Internal conflicts intensified. Roman emperors, especially Trajan, conducted aggressive eastern campaigns that temporarily captured Parthian territories. In 224 CE, the Parthian Empire fell to the rising Han Dynasty, which would reorganize Persian power and introduce new approaches to managing trade. But the Parthian model had proven its value. For nearly 5 centuries, they had dominated the central sections of what would become known as the Silk Road. They had demonstrated that controlling strategic corridors and managing information could generate wealth rivaling military conquest. They had built a commercial infrastructure that their successors would inherit and continue. Rome's silk fever, gold drain, and the quest for the Ceres. Silk arrived in Rome like a rumor before becoming an obsession. The first Romans to see silk in quantity were probably soldiers at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, where Parthian forces under General Serena displayed enormous standards made of glistening fabric that caught the desert sun. The Roman army, led by the ambitious general Marcus Crassus, was decisively defeated in that battle. Crassus himself was executed following his capture. But the memory of those shimmering banners survived, carried back by the few Roman soldiers who escaped. Within decades, silk began appearing in Roman markets. It arrived through Parthian middlemen, already marked up several times from its original price. Early Roman silk was extraordinarily expensive, literally worth its weight in gold, according to some accounts. Only the wealthiest Romans could afford it. Emperors, senators, and successful merchants adorned themselves and their homes with silk furnishings. For women of the Roman elite, silk garments became markers of status and wealth. But silk's appeal went beyond simple scarcity. The fabric possessed qualities unlike anything produced in the Mediterranean. It was light, cool, and comfortable in hot weather. Its texture was impossibly smooth against skin. Most dramatically, it could be dyed in brilliant colors and woven into patterns of extraordinary complexity. Chinese weavers had developed techniques over centuries that Roman craftsmen could not replicate. Silk was not just expensive, it was unique. Roman society's response was characteristically divided. The wealthy purchased silk enthusiastically, driving ever-increasing demand. Fashion among elite women increasingly featured silk garments, some so fine they were nearly transparent. These see-through silks particularly scandalized conservative Romans, who associated them with immodesty and moral decline. Sumptuary laws were proposed, attempting to limit silk consumption. They failed repeatedly. Economic attraction outweighed moral legislation. The most vocal critic was Pliny the Elder, whose natural history preserved a calculation that would echo through Roman discourse. He estimated that India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula extracted approximately 100 million sesterces annually from the Roman economy. This was the price, he argued, of Roman luxury and female vanity. The number became famous, repeated by senators and moralists, as evidence of Roman decadence. Whether accurate or not, it captured a real concern. Rome's trade balance with the East was dramatically negative. Roman gold and silver flowed eastward in staggering quantities to purchase silk, spices, precious stones, and other luxuries. The Mediterranean Empire produced relatively little that Eastern markets valued comparably. Roman wine and olive oil had limited appeal in regions that produced their own. Glass from Roman workshops found Eastern buyers, and Mediterranean coral was prized for jewelry. But nothing balanced the cost of silk and spices. Roman currency drained eastward, enriching Parthian, Central Asian, and Chinese merchants. This gold drain concerned Roman administrators beyond simple moralism. The empire's monetary system required adequate precious metal circulation. When gold and silver left for the east and did not return, it affected domestic currency supply. Some historians argue this contributed to inflation and economic instability in later imperial periods. Whether the silk trade's impact was truly macroeconomic or merely noticeable to contemporary observers remains debated, but Romans certainly perceived it as a problem. Rome's solution was to seek alternative routes and suppliers. If Parthian middlemen were marking up prices excessively, direct trade might reduce costs. If silk came from distant Sarus somewhere in the east, perhaps routes existed that bypassed Parthia entirely. Roman merchants and government officials began gathering intelligence about Eastern geography and exploring alternative pathways. The sea route through the Red Sea offered one alternative. During the 1st century CE, Roman-controlled Egypt developed ports on the Red Sea coast specifically for Indian Ocean trade. Ships departed loaded with gold and silver, sailed with the monsoon winds to Indian ports, purchased goods that had arrived from further east, and returned with the seasonal wind reversal. This maritime commerce partially circumvented Parthian territory, though it never fully replaced overland routes. The geography of Indian Ocean trade was recorded in a remarkable document called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written around 60 CE. This merchant's guide described ports, products, sailing seasons, and commercial practices from the Red Sea to India's west coast and beyond. It revealed a complex, sophisticated trading world that operated according to well-understood patterns. Roman merchants had learned monsoon timing, port protocols, and market prices. They were no longer dependent solely on information from Parthian sources, but China itself remained mysterious. Romans used the term Sarus to describe the silk makers, but had no clear understanding of their location, culture, or political organization. Some Roman writers speculated that silk grew on trees, was harvested like wool from special sheep, or was produced by extraordinary insects. The truth that it came from silkworm cocoons carefully cultivated and processed by Chinese artisans remained unknown. The Parthians protected this information carefully, knowing that mystery sustained premium pricing. Several Roman attempts at direct contact with the Sarahs are recorded, all unsuccessful. The geographer Marinus of Tyre, whose work was later incorporated by Ptolemy, described merchants who traveled unprecedented distances eastward. One account mentioned a merchant named Mace Titianus, who sent agents deep into Central Asia, possibly reaching the Tarim Basin. These expeditions gathered geographical information but did not establish direct Roman-Chinese commerce. Distance, political obstacles, and Parthian resistance prevented systematic contact. The lack of direct contact meant Romans and Chinese remained ignorant of each other for centuries. Han histories mention a distant Western empire called Da Qin, described as possessing wealth and civilization comparable to China. Chinese records suggest some awareness of Roman existence, but no clear understanding of Roman geography, politics, or culture. Similarly, Roman sources describe the Sarahs vaguely, mixing fact with fantasy. The two great empires at opposite ends of Eurasia knew of each other only through distorted reports from intermediaries. In 166 CE, according to Chinese historical records, a group claiming to represent the Roman emperor arrived at the Han court. The history identifies the emperor as Antun, possibly a transliteration of Antoninus, referring to either Antoninus Pius or Marcus Aurelius. The envoys brought gifts, including elephant ivory and rhinoceros horn. However, Chinese officials noted with disappointment that the gifts were not particularly extraordinary or rare, suggesting these might have been private merchants rather than official ambassadors. The incident demonstrates both Roman interest in direct contact and the difficulty of achieving it. The persistent Roman demand for silk had several consequences beyond gold drain. It stimulated attempts at domestic silk production, though Romans lacked silkworms and the knowledge to cultivate them. Some entrepreneurs tried breeding silk moths in Mediterranean climates with limited success. Others experimented with unraveling imported silk thread and reweaving it with linen or wool, creating hybrid fabrics that stretched expensive imports further. These attempts reflected Roman frustration with import dependency. The silk trade also affected diplomatic relations across Eurasia. Rome's eastern wars with Parthia, fought ostensibly over Armenia and Mesopotamia, also had commercial dimensions. Controlling routes meant controlling commerce. When Roman armies temporarily captured Parthian territories, including Ctesiphon in 116 CE under Emperor Trajan, they briefly accessed silk routes directly. These military successes were rarely permanent, but they demonstrated Roman interest in commercial as well as territorial advantage. Roman silk consumption evolved over time. Early silk garments were rare luxuries, owned by emperors and the extremely wealthy. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, silk had become more widely available, though still expensive. A broader elite could afford silk trim on garments, silk furnishings, and smaller silk items. This democratization of luxury reflected increasing trade volumes. More silk entered the empire annually, even as prices remained high. The market was expanding, both in quantity and in the range of consumers who could participate. The cultural impact extended beyond economics. Silk became associated with Eastern exoticism, spiritual mystery, and sensual indulgence. Roman literature referenced silk in contexts suggesting both desire and moral anxiety. Poets described women in silk garments with admiration mixed with disapproval. Silk represented the seductive, dangerous East, a source of pleasure that might corrupt Roman virtue. These anxieties reflected broader Roman ambivalence about Eastern influences. Yet despite all the moralizing, the gold drain, the diplomatic maneuvering, and the quest for direct access, silk continued flowing westward. Roman gold continued flowing east. The Parthians continued profiting from their middleman position. And the Sarahs, the mysterious silk makers, remained distant and unknown to those who valued their product above almost anything else the ancient world offered. The economic relationship had achieved stability, driven by seemingly insatiable Roman demand meeting Chinese surplus production. The Silk Road functioned, even when no one fully understood its entire length or the civilizations at its endpoints. The Kushan confluence, Buddhism on the Silk Road. Between the Parthian West and the Chinese East, the Kushan Empire emerged as a crucible where cultures collided and fused. Rising in the 1st century CE from the Yuezhi people who had fled westward centuries earlier, the Kushans built an empire spanning from Central Asia through Afghanistan into northern India. Their territories encompassed the Gandhara region, where the mountains met the plains, where East met West, where Indian, Greek, Persian, and Central Asian traditions encountered each other daily. Here, Buddhism would transform from a regional Indian religion into a world faith, largely through Kushan patronage and the trade routes they controlled. The Kushan kings ruled diverse populations: Indians, Greeks descended from Alexander's colonies, Iranians, various Central Asian peoples. Each group maintained distinct languages, religions, and customs. Rather than imposing uniformity, the Kushans embraced plurality. Their coins displayed Greek inscriptions alongside titles in the Indian Brahmi script. Coin imagery featured Greek gods, Iranian deities, Indian Buddhas, and Kushan rulers, sometimes all on a single monetary series. This eclectic approach reflected both practical politics and genuine cultural openness. Buddhism had existed in India for centuries before the Kushans, but it had remained largely regional. The religion offered a path to enlightenment through ethical conduct, meditation, and wisdom, rejecting the caste system that dominated Indian society. Various schools of Buddhist thought competed, developing different interpretations of the Buddha's teachings. Some emphasized monastic life and individual enlightenment. Others developed devotional practices accessible to laypeople. The religion was diverse, sophisticated, but geographically limited. Kushan patronage transformed this situation. King Kanishka, ruling sometime in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, became Buddhism's most important royal supporter since the Indian Emperor Ashoka centuries earlier. Kanishka constructed stupas, endowed monasteries, and convened Buddhist councils to standardize doctrine. His massive stupa at Peshawar, described by later Chinese pilgrims, reportedly reached heights that made it visible from extraordinary distances. Archaeological excavations have revealed its enormous foundation, confirming the scale Chinese accounts emphasized. Under Kushan rule, Gandhara developed a distinctive artistic tradition that would influence Buddhist art across Asia. Gandharan sculpture blended Hellenistic techniques with Buddhist subjects, creating the first widespread anthropomorphic representations of the Buddha. Earlier Indian Buddhist art had avoided depicting the Buddha directly, using symbols instead. Gandharan artists, trained in Greek sculptural traditions, represented the Buddha as a human figure with idealized Greek features: wavy hair, symmetrical proportions, draped robes falling in naturalistic folds. These Gandharan Buddha images possessed specific characteristics that became standard. The Ushnisha, a cranial protuberance representing wisdom, topped the head. Elongated earlobes suggested the heavy earrings the Buddha wore before his renunciation. Hand gestures, or mudras, conveyed specific meanings: fearlessness, teaching, meditation. The artistic vocabulary developed in Gandhara would travel with Buddhism across Asia, modified by local traditions, but maintaining recognizable core elements. Gandharan art also depicted bodhisattvas, enlightened beings who postponed their final liberation to help others achieve enlightenment. These figures were shown wearing jewelry, fine clothes, and elaborate hairstyles, contrasting with the Buddha's monastic simplicity. Bodhisattva imagery appealed to lay practitioners who found austere monastic ideals difficult. The compassionate bodhisattva, accessible and adorned, became central to the Mahayana Buddhist tradition that developed during this period. Mahayana Buddhism represented a significant evolution in Buddhist thought, emphasizing universal enlightenment rather than individual liberation. Its texts promised that enlightenment was accessible to all beings, not merely monks who could dedicate lives to meditation. Mahayana sutras described multiple Buddhas and bodhisattvas, cosmic beings who responded to prayers and devotions. This more accessible devotional Buddhism proved easier to transmit across cultural boundaries than the earlier, more philosophical traditions. Kushan territories provided ideal conditions for this religious development. Monasteries along trade routes hosted monks from various regions, facilitating exchange of texts and ideas. Merchants traveling the Silk Road often supported monasteries financially, commissioning art and copying scriptures as acts of merit. The monasteries, in turn, provided lodging, food, and safety to traveling merchants. A mutually beneficial relationship developed, with commerce and religion supporting each other. The translation of Buddhist texts from Indian languages into Central Asian languages began in Kushan territories. Gandhara used a language called Gandhari, written in Kharosthi script. Buddhist manuscripts in Gandhari dating to the first few centuries CE are among the oldest surviving Buddhist texts. These manuscripts, preserved accidentally in the dry climate of Afghanistan and Central Asia, provide evidence of Buddhism's textual transmission. They show which texts were considered important, how they were modified as they moved between regions, and the process by which Indian Buddhism became Central Asian Buddhism. From Gandhara, Buddhism spread northward into the Tarim Basin, the region Zhongqian had explored and the Han Dynasty now sought to control. Kushan influence reached Kashgar and Khotan, where Buddhist monasteries were established alongside existing communities. The oasis cities, already serving as commercial way stations, became religious centers as well. Monks traveling eastward stayed at these monasteries, studied local languages, and prepared for the next leg of their journeys. One crucial figure in this transmission was Lokaksema, a Kushan monk who reached China around 147 CE. Lokaksema established himself in Luoyang, the Han capital, and began translating Buddhist texts from Gandhari and Sanskrit into Chinese. His translations introduced key Mahayana concepts to Chinese audiences, including the Prajnaparamita literature emphasizing wisdom and Pure Land texts describing Buddha lands where rebirth guaranteed enlightenment. These texts would profoundly influence Chinese Buddhism, but their journey to China depended entirely on the Silk Road networks and Kushan intermediaries. The physical journey for these missionary monks was extraordinary. From Gandhara to Chinese territory required crossing the Pamirs, the roof of the world, where mountain passes reached above 4,000 meters. Altitude sickness, bandits, and extreme weather made crossing deadly. Monks traveling with minimal possessions, dependent on charity, faced additional hardships. That they continued making these journeys decade after decade demonstrates both religious commitment and the gradually improving infrastructure of the Silk Road. The monasteries themselves became repositories of art and knowledge. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang, begun in 366 CE, eventually contained hundreds of cave temples painted with Buddhist imagery. These were not isolated meditation caves, but elaborate libraries, art galleries, and pilgrimage destinations. Similar cave complexes developed across Central Asia, Bamiyan in Afghanistan, Kazil in the Tarim Basin, and numerous others. Each synthesized local artistic traditions with Buddhist iconography, creating regional styles while maintaining connection to the broader Buddhist world. Kushan numismatic evidence reveals the complexity of their religious landscape. While kings like Kanishka patronized Buddhism extensively, Kushan coins depicted the Zoroastrian deity Ahura Mazda, Greek gods like Helios, and Indian deities like Shiva. This religious plurality was not contradiction but policy. The Kushans recognized that their diverse subjects maintained different faiths, and imperial tolerance facilitated both political stability and commercial prosperity. Buddhist monks traveled safely through Kushan territories alongside Zoroastrian priests, Greek merchants, and Chinese envoys. The Kushan economic system supported all this religious and cultural activity. Trade generated wealth that funded monastery construction, supported monks, and commissioned art. Archaeological excavations at Kushan sites reveal Roman coins, Chinese silk, Indian gems, and Central Asian metalwork, evidence of extensive commerce. The Kushans issued gold coins in imitation of Roman ore, facilitating trade with Western regions. These coins circulated widely, found in hoards across Central Asia, demonstrating the reach of Kushan commercial networks. By the 3rd century CE, Kushan power was fragmenting under pressure from the rising Sasanian Empire in the west and various powers in India to the south, but the cultural patterns they had established persisted. Buddhist monasteries continued functioning. Trade routes remained active. The artistic and textual traditions developed under Kushan patronage continued influencing Buddhist art from Afghanistan to China and eventually to Japan. The Kushans themselves might have faded politically, but their legacy as cultural intermediaries proved more durable than their empire. The Han Protectorate, securing the Hexi Corridor. The information Zhang Qian brought back from his journeys presented Emperor Wu with both opportunity and obligation. The western regions contained wealthy kingdoms, valuable goods, and potential allies, but they also remained vulnerable to Xiongnu control. If the Han Dynasty wanted access to the western trade routes, it would need to secure the Hexi Corridor, the narrow passage running between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert. This territory, controlled by the Xiongnu, was the gateway to everything Zhang Qian had described. Without it, China remained isolated. With it, the world opened. Emperor Wu committed to military expansion. The campaigns he launched between 127 and 119 BCE rank among the most ambitious in Chinese military history. General Wei Qing led the first major offensives, driving Xiongnu forces from the Ordos region and the Hexi Corridor. His nephew, Huo Qing, emerged as an even more aggressive commander, conducting raids that reached deep into Xiongnu territory. These campaigns were extraordinarily expensive, requiring tens of thousands of cavalry, enormous logistical support, and years of continuous fighting. The battles for the Hexi Corridor were particularly fierce. The Xiongnu understood what losing this territory meant: loss of access to the oases, loss of tribute from the western regions, loss of strategic depth. They fought desperately to maintain control. Han forces responded with tactics developed specifically for steppe warfare. Chinese cavalry, mounted on horses improved by Central Asian breeds, could now match Xiongnu mobility. Combined infantry and cavalry tactics, sophisticated supply systems, and numerical superiority gradually wore down Xiongnu resistance. By 121 BCE, the Hexi Corridor was under Han control. The victory was expensive but decisive. The Han immediately began consolidating their position. 4 military commanderies were established: Juquan, Jiangye, Wuwei, and Dunhuang. These administrative units combined military garrison with civil administration, designed to hold territory permanently rather than simply raid and withdraw. Each commandery received soldier settlers who would farm in peacetime and fight when necessary, creating a self-sustaining military presence. The Great Wall, already ancient by Han times, was extended westward. New sections stretched toward Dunhuang, creating a defended line protecting the Hexi Corridor and the routes beyond. These western sections differed from earlier walls. Built with rammed earth and local materials, incorporating watchtowers and signal stations, they served more as communication systems than absolute barriers. Fire signals could transmit warnings of approaching threats across hundreds of kilometers in hours, allowing rapid military response. Archaeological work along these western wall sections has revealed extensive infrastructure. Watchtowers stood at regular intervals, each garrisoned by small units that maintained signal fires and patrolled their sections. Documents preserved in the dry climate include military reports, supply records, and personal letters from soldiers stationed in these remote posts. The records reveal the mundane realities of frontier service: complaints about food, requests for warmer clothing, boredom alternating with terror when attacks came. The garrison posts required enormous logistical support. Soldiers needed food, clothing, weapons, and replacements. The Hexi Corridor could not supply these needs locally. Everything had to be transported from China proper, along increasingly extended supply lines. The Han government developed sophisticated systems for managing these logistics: dedicated transport units, supply depots at regular intervals, and agricultural colonies where soldier farmers produced food locally to reduce transportation costs. Beyond the commanderies lay the western regions proper, the Tarim Basin oases that Zhang Qian had visited. These kingdoms maintained nominal independence, but Han military presence in the Hexi Corridor made them vulnerable to Chinese pressure. Some oasis kingdoms sought Han alliance voluntarily, hoping Chinese military power would protect them from the Xiongnu or rival cities. Others resisted, preferring independence to tributary status. Han policy varied between military coercion and diplomatic persuasion, depending on circumstances and the kingdoms involved. In 60 BCE, the Han established the Protectorate of the Western Regions, headquartered at Wulei near modern Luntai. This office marked a shift from military conquest to administrative control. The Protector General oversaw relationships with dozens of oasis kingdoms, arbitrated disputes, protected caravans, and maintained Chinese influence without direct occupation. It was a clever system, providing security for trade routes while limiting the costs of military presence. The first protector general faced immediate challenges. The Oasis kingdoms had complex relationships among themselves, shifting alliances and occasional conflicts. Nomadic groups beyond Chinese control continued raiding. The Xiongnu, though weakened, remained present and could exploit any Han weakness. Managing these competing interests required diplomatic skill, military credibility, and substantial autonomy from the distant court in Chang'an. The protectorate's greatest value was providing security for merchants. Caravans traveling through the western regions now had access to Han military posts, could appeal to Chinese authority when threatened, and benefited from Han efforts to suppress banditry. The economic impact was immediate. Trade volumes increased substantially. More Chinese silk flowed westward. More Central Asian horses, jade, and other goods reached China. The correlation between military control and commercial expansion was direct and obvious, but maintaining this system was brutally expensive. The military campaigns themselves had cost enormous sums. The ongoing garrison expenses continued draining the treasury. Scholar officials at court debated whether the western regions were worth the cost. Some argued that the tribute received and trade benefits justified the expense. Others calculated that costs exceeded benefits, that China was impoverishing itself for marginal advantage. These debates would continue for centuries, reflecting genuine uncertainty about imperial priorities. Emperor Wu's later years saw these fiscal strains manifest as crisis. The military campaigns had required increased taxation, forced labor, and monetary manipulation. Agricultural production suffered as farmers were conscripted for military service or frontier settlement. By the end of Wu's reign in 87 BCE, the Han economy was exhausted. His successors faced the task of consolidating gains while reducing costs, a challenge that would shape Han policy for generations. Despite the fiscal stress, the strategic logic of controlling the Hexi corridor and maintaining presence in the western regions proved sound. The Xiongnu never regained their previous dominance over these territories. Chinese influence, once established, persisted through periods of weaker central authority. The infrastructure built during these campaigns, the walls, the garrison posts, the administrative systems, continued functioning long after Emperor Wu's death. The military success also enabled cultural exchange that was transforming Chinese civilization. Buddhist monks began arriving along the routes Han forces had secured. Foreign goods appeared in Chinese markets. Knowledge of Western kingdoms broadened. The Han court received envoys from Parthia, from various Central Asian kingdoms, even reports of the distant Roman Empire. China was no longer isolated. The world was visible, accessible, fascinating. The Silk Road Wars, as these campaigns came to be known, were fundamentally about control of trade routes. They reflected a calculation that securing these routes justified enormous military expense. Later dynasties would make similar calculations, sometimes reaching different conclusions. But the Han precedent was established. The western regions could be controlled, and controlling them brought benefits that extended far beyond simple tribute or military advantage. Ideas, religions, art, and technologies flowed along routes protected by Han garrisons. The military presence enabled a great exchange. The monastic bazaar, Buddhism's journey to China. Buddhism arrived in China not as a single event, but as a gradual infiltration carried by merchants, missionaries, and chance encounters along the Silk Road. The exact date remains unclear, probably sometime in the 1st century CE. The religion entered a civilization that already possessed sophisticated philosophical traditions, Confucian social ethics, and Taoist spiritual practices. Buddhism had to adapt, translate itself linguistically and conceptually, and demonstrate relevance to Chinese concerns. The process took centuries, but the Silk Road provided both the physical pathway and the cultural infrastructure that made transmission possible. The earliest Chinese converts were probably merchants in the Western territories who encountered Buddhism through trading partners. These border regions, exposed to Central Asian influences, proved receptive to foreign ideas. Buddhist images, texts, and practices entered China alongside silk, horses, and jade, just another commodity in the vast exchange the Silk Road facilitated. Initially, Buddhism appeared exotic, barely distinguishable from various Taoist practices. The Chinese terminology for Buddhist concepts borrowed heavily from Taoism, creating confusion about whether Buddhism was a foreign religion or a variant of familiar traditions. The first Buddhist missionaries to reach China proper faced enormous challenges. They spoke no Chinese. Chinese monks understood no Sanskrit or Gandhari. Translation required extraordinary effort, often proceeding through multiple intermediaries. A missionary might explain a concept in Sanskrit to a Central Asian merchant who spoke some Chinese, who would then attempt to convey the meaning to Chinese monks, who would finally produce a written Chinese text. The potential for misunderstanding and distortion was immense. Lokak Sema, arriving around 147 CE, was among the first translators to attempt systematic work. His translations of Mahayana sutras introduced concepts that would reshape Chinese thought, but the translations were rough, filled with transliterated terms for which no Chinese equivalents existed. Later translators would refine these texts, but Lokak Sema's pioneering work established templates and vocabulary that influenced all subsequent translation efforts. The challenge went beyond language. Buddhist texts assumed Indian cultural context, references to Indian geography, social structures, and philosophical debates that meant nothing to Chinese readers. Translators had to decide whether to explain this context or adapt text to Chinese circumstances. Most chose adaptation, creating texts that were simultaneously Buddhist and Chinese, foreign yet familiar. This creative translation would prove crucial to Buddhism's successful transmission. Kumarajiv, arriving in China in 401 CE after years of captivity, revolutionized Buddhist translation. Born in Kucha to an Indian father and a Kuchian mother, Kumarajiva spoke multiple languages and understood both Indian and Central Asian Buddhism intimately. His translations achieved unprecedented elegance, expressing Buddhist ideas in beautiful Chinese prose. More importantly, Kumarajiva trained Chinese disciples in translation methodology, creating a translation bureau that could continue his work. Under Kumarajiva's influence, Chinese Buddhism began maturing from exotic import to established tradition. But translation alone could not have achieved Buddhism's success without institutional support. Monasteries provided crucial infrastructure. As Buddhism spread along the Silk Road, monasteries were established at regular intervals, serving multiple functions simultaneously. They housed monks engaged in religious practice. They provided lodging for traveling merchants and pilgrims. They served as libraries, preserving and copying texts. They functioned as educational centers, training novice monks and offering basic education to lay supporters. The most famous monastery complex developed at Dunhuang at the eastern terminus of the Tarim Basin routes. Beginning in 366 CE, Buddhist devotees began excavating caves from the sandstone cliffs outside the city. These caves, eventually numbering in the hundreds, were decorated with paintings depicting Buddha's lives, Jataka tales, and scenes from sutras. The artistic styles visible at Dunhuang demonstrate the international nature of Silk Road Buddhism. Indian iconography blends with Central Asian motifs and Chinese artistic conventions, creating a synthetic visual language. Dunhuang also preserved an extraordinary library. In Cave 17, sealed around 1000 CE and rediscovered in 1900, archaeologists found tens of thousands of manuscripts. These included Buddhist texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and other languages, but also secular documents, contracts, official records, personal letters, even musical scores. The Dunhuang Library Cache demonstrates the centrality of Buddhist monasteries to Silk Road culture. They were not isolated religious sites, but integrated into commercial, administrative, and cultural networks. Other cave temple complexes developed throughout the Silk Road region. Bezeklik in Turfan, Kizil near Kucha, Bamiyan in Afghanistan, dozens of sites where Buddhist devotees excavated caves, commissioned paintings, and established monasteries. Each complex reflected local artistic traditions while maintaining recognizable Buddhist characteristics. The cave temples served practical purposes, providing stable temperature spaces in extreme climates, creating pilgrimage destinations that attracted donors, and displaying wealth and devotion publicly. Chinese pilgrims began traveling to India seeking authentic Buddhist texts and visiting holy sites. Faxian's journey, beginning in 399 CE, pioneered this tradition. He traveled through the Tarim Basin, crossed the Pamirs, visited Buddhist sites across northern India, and returned by sea after 15 years abroad. His account of the journey, Record of Buddhist Kingdoms, provided Chinese readers with detailed descriptions of lands they had only heard about vaguely. Faxian described flourishing Buddhism in Central Asia and India, sophisticated monastic universities, and texts still unknown in China. Faxian's journey was extraordinary but not unique. Other Chinese pilgrims followed, most famously Xuanzang in the 7th century. These pilgrims were not tourists but scholars, seeking texts, teachers, and understanding. They studied for years in Indian monasteries, often learning Sanskrit, debating Buddhist doctrine, and collecting manuscripts. Upon returning to China, they translated texts, described their journeys, and influenced Chinese Buddhist development. The Silk Road made these scholarly exchanges possible, connecting China to Buddhism's Indian heartland. The monasteries also provided economic functions that facilitated trade. Monks maintained grain stores that could sustain travelers through difficult periods. Monasteries offered currency exchange, converting coins between different systems. Some monasteries extended credit to merchants, financing caravans in exchange for donations when expeditions succeeded. These practical services embedded Buddhism within Silk Road commerce, making monasteries stakeholders in trade's continuation. Wealthy merchants supported monasteries with donations, commissioning cave paintings, funding text copying, and endowing perpetual oil lamps. These donations were acts of merit, generating spiritual benefit according to Buddhist teaching. But they also provided social capital, displaying wealth and piety publicly. A merchant who funded an elaborate cave temple advertised his success and earned community respect. Religious and economic motivations intertwined inseparably. Buddhism also adapted its message to merchant concerns. Sutras emphasize the merit earned through righteous commerce, the spiritual value of supporting the Buddhist community, and the possibility of enlightenment for lay people engaged in worldly activities. While monastic Buddhism valued renunciation, the Buddhism that traveled the Silk Road accommodated merchant lifestyles, creating a tradition that could thrive in commercial environments. The artistic legacy of Silk Road Buddhism demonstrates this synthesis. Dunhuang paintings include numerous depictions of merchants, caravans, and trade goods alongside Buddhist devotional imagery. Donor portraits show wealthy merchants and their families dressed in expensive silks, kneeling before Buddhist figures. These paintings celebrate both spiritual devotion and material success, reflecting the values of the communities that created them. By the 5th century CE, Buddhism was firmly established in China, with monasteries, growing numbers of monks, imperial patronage, and increasingly sophisticated Chinese Buddhist thought. The religion had traveled from India through Central Asia to China, adapting at each stage while maintaining core teachings. The Silk Road had provided the route, the infrastructure, and the cultural conditions that made this transmission possible. Buddhism was no longer simply Indian. It had become Central Asian and Chinese as well, transformed by its journey while transforming the societies it entered. The Sasanian ascendancy, Persian silk, silver, and statecraft. In 224 CE, the last Parthian king fell in battle against Ardashir Firfirst, a regional ruler from the province of Pars who would establish the Sasanian dynasty. The new Persian Empire that emerged from this conquest would dominate the central sections of the Silk Road for over 4 centuries, implementing far more centralized control than the Parthians had achieved. The Sasanians combined military power, economic sophistication, and cultural ambition, creating an empire that rivaled Rome in grandeur and exceeded it in commercial organization. The Sasanians explicitly positioned themselves as heirs to the ancient Achaemenid Persians who had ruled before Alexander's conquests. They adopted King of Kings as their primary title, revived Zoroastrian rituals as state religion, and cultivated Persian identity with deliberate policy. This revival was not merely nostalgic but served practical purposes, legitimizing their rule and distinguishing their regime from the Parthian dynasty they had overthrown. The Sasanians presented themselves as restorers of Persian glory, rectifying centuries of foreign influence. Their approach to trade differed markedly from Parthian practices. While the Parthians had allowed considerable autonomy to merchant communities and regional powers, the Sasanians implemented direct state control over commerce. Royal monopolies governed certain trade goods, especially silk. Customs houses at borders extracted tariffs according to standardized schedules. Official warehouses stored goods awaiting transport. This systematization increased state revenue but reduced merchant autonomy, creating tensions that would influence Silk Road dynamics for centuries. Sasanian Persia produced luxury goods that competed with imports. Their metalwork, especially silver vessels decorated with hunting scenes, banquet depictions, and royal portraits, ranked among antiquity's finest. These pieces, produced in royal workshops, combined technical mastery with artistic sophistication. Sasanian silver appears in archaeological contexts from Japan to France, evidence of extensive distribution networks. Some pieces traveled as diplomatic gifts, others as trade goods, but all advertised Sasanian cultural prestige. Textile production under the Sasanians reached extraordinary levels. While they could not produce silk thread, which remained a Chinese monopoly, they developed techniques for processing raw Chinese silk into finished fabrics. Sasanian weavers created complex patterns, roundels containing animals, geometric designs, inscriptions, and royal imagery. These Sasanian silks, often called Zandaniji after a production center, combined Chinese material with Persian aesthetics, creating hybrid products that commanded premium prices throughout the medieval world. Zoroastrianism, promoted as state religion, influenced Sasanian policies toward Silk Road trade. Zoroastrian fire temples received state support, with priests enjoying official status. The religion's ethical framework, emphasizing truth, order, and opposition to chaos, informed governance ideals. Zoroastrian communities existed throughout Sasanian territories and along trade routes into Central Asia. The religion traveled with Persian merchants, though it never achieved Buddhism's international spread. Zoroastrian diaspora communities maintained fire temples in distant cities, providing Persian merchants with familiar religious institutions. The Sasanian relationship with Rome proved continuously hostile, far more consistently than under the Parthians. A series of wars, beginning in the 230s and continuing intermittently until the 7th century, repeatedly disrupted overland trade. These conflicts focused on control of Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Syria, territories that straddled crucial routes connecting Mediterranean to Persian territories. When Sasanian and Roman armies fought in these regions, caravans could not pass safely. Merchants sought alternative routes or waited for peace, causing trade fluctuations that affected economies across Eurasia. The wars had mixed economic motivations. Controlling territory meant controlling trade revenue. But warfare also served ideological purposes. The Sasanians positioned themselves as equals to Rome, the other great power claiming universal sovereignty. Their emperors demanded recognition as Rome's equals, not subordinates or inferiors. Military confrontations demonstrated this parity, each side winning and losing battles, conquering and losing territories, but neither achieving decisive superiority. The long stalemate reflected rough equality between the two empires. These conflicts inadvertently promoted maritime trade routes. When overland routes became too dangerous, merchants shifted commerce to sea lanes. Ships traveling through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, then across the Indian Ocean to India and beyond, could avoid war zones entirely. The Sasanians controlled Persian Gulf ports and profited from this maritime trade, but the revenue was different from overland customs. Maritime routes were harder to monopolize, easier for individual merchants to navigate, and less subject to centralized control. The Sasanian state attempted to manage this maritime commerce through port facilities, naval forces, and diplomatic relations with kingdoms controlling key harbors. The Persian Gulf became a Sasanian sphere of influence, with ports like Siraf developing into major commercial centers. These ports connected overland routes from the Persian interior with maritime networks extending to India, Ceylon, and potentially beyond. The integration of land and sea routes maximized Sasanian commercial advantage, though it never matched the complete control they desired. Relations with China remained indirect, but economically significant. Chinese historical sources describe embassies to Persia, though the details are often vague. The Sasanians sent envoys to Chinese courts, carrying gifts and establishing diplomatic relations. These contacts facilitated trade but did not create direct commercial links. Sogdian merchants speaking an Iranian language and maintaining communities across Central Asia served as primary intermediaries between Chinese and Persian merchants. The Sogdians would become legendary for their commercial skills, but their prominence reflected the persistence of intermediary systems even under powerful empires. Sasanian artistic influence spread extensively along the Silk Road. Their motifs, especially the roundel design featuring confronted animals or royal hunting scenes, appeared on textiles, metalwork, and ceramics throughout Asia. Chinese artists adopted Persian designs, modifying them to suit Chinese aesthetics. Japanese imperial treasuries preserved Sasanian silver and glass, arrived via the Silk Road centuries after their creation. This artistic exchange reflected deeper cultural admiration. Sasanian Persia represented sophistication, power, and refined luxury to Eastern audiences. The Sasanian administrative system for managing trade was notably bureaucratic. Official posts existed for inspecting goods, assessing customs duties, and maintaining roads. Caravanserais, rest stops for traveling merchants, were constructed at regular intervals along major routes. These facilities provided security, basic amenities, and official oversight. Merchants appreciated the services but resented the costs and regulations. The tension between state control and merchant autonomy would persist throughout Sasanian history. Sasanian coinage reflected their commercial sophistication. Silver drachms bearing royal portraits and Zoroastrian fire altars circulated extensively, found in hoards from Scandinavia to India. The consistency of these coins' weight and purity made them reliable for long-distance commerce. Merchants preferred Sasanian silver to more variable local currencies, giving Sasanian money international status. This monetary dominance provided economic advantages beyond simple trade, allowing the Sasanian state to influence distant markets through currency policy. Religious diversity within Sasanian territories created complex situations. While Zoroastrianism received state support, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, and Manichaean communities existed and sometimes flourished. The Sasanians alternated between tolerance and persecution, depending on political circumstances and the perceived loyalty of minority communities. Christians faced particular suspicion when Sasanian Roman wars intensified, seen as potential supporters of the Christian Roman enemy. Despite periodic persecutions, religious minorities persisted, maintaining communities and institutions throughout Sasanian rule. Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, emerged from Sasanian Persia and spread along Silk Road networks. This dualistic religion, combining elements from Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, proved particularly suited to long-distance transmission. Manichaean missionaries followed trade routes eastward, establishing communities in Central Asia and eventually China. The religion's organization resembled a commercial network, with hierarchy, regular communication between communities, and systematic propagation. Though Mani himself died in Sasanian captivity, persecuted by Zoroastrian priests, his religion survived and spread, demonstrating the Silk Road's capacity to transmit ideas even when originating powers opposed them. By the 6th century, Sasanian control extended deep into Central Asia, competing with nomadic powers for influence over the oasis cities. The Sasanians subsidized local rulers, stationed troops in strategic locations, and attempted to monopolize trade routes. But sustaining this expanded control proved difficult. Nomadic groups remained militarily formidable, local kingdoms resisted direct rule, and the vast distances made administration costly. The Sasanians achieved influence but not domination in the eastern reaches of their claimed territories. The competition with Byzantium, as the Eastern Roman Empire became known, intensified in the 6th century. Both empires sought alternative silk sources, attempting to break Chinese monopoly. According to Byzantine sources, silks smuggling succeeded around 550 CE, when Christian monks concealed silkworm eggs in hollow bamboo staffs and delivered them to Constantinople. Whether accurate or legendary, this account reflects the high value both empires placed on controlling silk production. If Byzantium could produce silk domestically, it would escape dependency on Persian intermediaries. The impact of Byzantine silk production on the Silk Road is debated. Byzantine sericulture developed gradually, never fully matching Chinese quality or production volume. Trade in raw silk and high-quality Chinese fabrics continued, but the mere existence of Byzantine production altered market dynamics, providing competition that likely moderated prices and reduced Sasanian monopoly power. The Sasanians responded by emphasizing their own high-quality silk weaving, creating products that competed on artistry rather than raw material availability. Sasanian art from their final century shows continuing vitality and international influence. Silver plates depicting elaborate hunting scenes, glass vessels with intricate designs, textiles with complex patterns, these luxury goods continued circulating long after the dynasty's fall. Islamic conquerors in the 7th century preserved and imitated many Sasanian artistic traditions, ensuring their influence extended into the medieval period. The Silk Road had transmitted Sasanian aesthetics eastward during their rule, and those influences persisted even after the empire itself disappeared. The steppe superhighway, nomads, the Sogdians, and the first global mail. The great empires commanded attention, but the steppes held power. North of the Silk Road's oasis corridors, grasslands stretched from Manchuria to Hungary, supporting populations who lived entirely differently from sedentary civilizations. These nomadic peoples herded animals, lived in portable dwellings, and possessed mobility that settled societies could never match. The steppes produced warriors who repeatedly terrorized empires, but they also created networks that moved goods, information, and people across Eurasia faster than any other system before modern times. The Xiongnu Confederation, which had dominated the eastern steppes during the Han Dynasty, represented the first major nomadic empire affecting the Silk Road. They controlled territories north of China, west into Central Asia, exerting influence over both settled societies and other nomadic groups. Their relationship with China alternated between warfare and trade, with the Chinese paying enormous tributes to maintain peace. These tribute goods included silk, grain, and manufactured items the nomads could not produce themselves. In exchange, China received horses and temporary security along its northern frontier. The Xiongnu did not simply raid and plunder. They operated sophisticated tribute systems, extracting wealth from both Chinese and Western territories. They protected merchants passing through their lands for a price. They maintained diplomatic relations with Central Asian kingdoms, sometimes allied with them against China, sometimes attacking them. The Xiongnu were not obstacles to trade, but participants in it, though their participation often involved coercion. Their military superiority derived from horsemanship. Xiongnu children learned riding before walking, archery from horseback before adolescence. Adult warriors could shoot accurately while galloping, execute complex maneuvers in coordinated units, and sustain cavalry raids for months. Settled societies struggled against such mobility. Infantry could not pursue cavalry across open grasslands. Fortifications could be bypassed. The steppes gave nomads strategic depth that absorbed counterattacks. But nomadic power had weaknesses. Political unity proved fragile, dependent on charismatic leaders who could maintain consensus among various tribal groups. When strong leaders died, confederations often fragmented into competing factions. Internal disputes weakened nomadic empires repeatedly, creating opportunities for settled societies to reassert control. The Xiongnu experienced this pattern. After centuries of dominance, they split into northern and southern groups in the 1st century CE, with the southern Xiongnu accepting Chinese suzerainty. Northern Xiongnu retreated westward, possibly influencing the emergence of the Huns who later appeared in European history, though this connection remains debated. The Rouran Confederation succeeded Xiongnu dominance in Mongolia, controlling the eastern steppes from the 4th to 6th centuries CE. They interacted extensively with the Northern Wei dynasty in China, alternating between warfare and diplomatic marriage alliances. Like the Xiongnu, the Rouran extracted tribute while allowing controlled trade. Their control extended westward into Central Asia, competing with the Sasanian Empire for influence over the Tarim Basin oases. The Gökturks, rising in the 6th century, created an even more extensive steppe empire. At their peak, they controlled territory from Manchuria to the Black Sea, encompassing virtually all the steppe corridor. The Gökturk Khagans, as their leaders were titled, maintained diplomatic relations with both China and Byzantium. Byzantine sources describe Gökturk embassies arriving in Constantinople, seeking alliance against their common Sasanian enemy. These diplomatic contacts demonstrate how far-reaching steppe networks had become. The Gökturks developed the Orkhon script, leaving stone inscriptions in Mongolia that preserve their history in their own words. These monuments describe military victories, political succession, and relationships with surrounding powers. They reveal sophisticated political thought and organizational complexity far exceeding the stereotype of nomads as simply destructive raiders. The Gökturks governed a multi-ethnic empire, managed long-distance commerce, and negotiated with the most powerful contemporary states as equals. But the real commercial specialists of the steppe corridor were the Sogdians. Originating from the region around Samarkand and Bukhara, speaking an Eastern Iranian language, the Sogdians created merchant networks that stretched from China to the Mediterranean. They established diaspora communities in cities throughout the Silk Road, maintained communication networks between these communities, and specialized in long-distance trade. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Sogdian merchants dominated Silk Road commerce, becoming the indispensable intermediaries connecting East and West. Sogdian success derived from several factors. They occupied strategic territory at the crossroads of multiple routes. Their language, written in a script derived from Aramaic, became a lingua franca for trade. They developed banking systems, credit instruments, and partnership arrangements that facilitated commerce. Most importantly, they maintained cohesive diaspora communities that could provide lodging, information, and financial services to traveling Sogdian merchants anywhere along the Silk Road. Archaeological discoveries at Penjikent and other Sogdian sites reveal wealthy urban culture. Wall paintings depict banquet scenes, musical performances, and daily life among wealthy merchants. These are not images of nomadic simplicity, but sophisticated urban prosperity. Sogdian cities featured grand houses, Buddhist and Zoroastrian temples, markets filled with international goods, and aristocratic families who controlled commerce and competed for political power. The Sogdians were not itinerant peddlers, but cosmopolitan urbanites who happened to specialize in long-distance trade. Sogdian merchant letters, preserved accidentally in a watchtower near Dunhuang, provide extraordinary insight into their operations. Written in Sogdian language, these letters date to around 313 CE. They discuss trade conditions, family matters, political situations in various regions, and the challenges of maintaining business across vast distances. One letter mentions the collapse of the Han Dynasty and its impact on Chinese markets. Another discusses prices for specific goods. These mundane business documents humanize the Silk Road, revealing the practical concerns of merchants whose trade linked continents. The Sogdians developed the Yam system, a relay communication network that prefigured later Mongol postal systems. Stations positioned at regular intervals maintained fresh horses and riders who could carry messages rapidly across vast distances. A letter could travel from Sogdiana in weeks rather than months, allowing merchants to respond to market changes, coordinate with partners, and manage far-flung business interests. This communication infrastructure provided crucial advantage, making information nearly as important as the goods being traded. Sogdian influence on Chinese culture was substantial. During the Tang Dynasty, Sogdian merchants, musicians, and artisans lived in Chang'an and other Chinese cities. They brought foreign goods, but also exotic fashions, new musical instruments, and novel religious ideas. Chinese fascination with Western exotica often meant specifically Sogdian culture. The famous Tang Dynasty figurines showing foreigners and camels typically depict Sogdian merchants and their caravans. Sogdians became the human face of the Silk Road for Chinese audiences. Religious diversity characterized Sogdian communities. They practiced Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and later Christianity, often within the same city or even family. This religious pluralism reflected their commercial pragmatism. Maintaining good relations with diverse customers required religious tolerance. Sogdian merchants could worship at fire temples, Buddhist monasteries, or Nestorian churches depending on location and circumstance. Religion served social and commercial functions as much as spiritual ones. The nomadic empires and Sogdian merchants created what might be called the steppe superhighway, paralleling the desert oasis routes but offering different advantages. Steppe routes allowed faster travel in some seasons, access to northern markets, and connections to different political systems. When southern routes became dangerous due to warfare or unstable kingdoms, northern routes through steppe territory offered alternatives. The two systems were complementary, providing redundancy that made the overall network more resilient. Nomadic empires and settled states maintained complex relationships that defied simple characterization as hostile. Yes, nomads raided settled territories, but they also traded with them, married into their elites, protected their merchants, and sometimes adopted their religions. The boundary between nomadic and settled worlds was more permeable than traditional narratives suggest. Individuals and groups crossed it in both directions. Former nomads settled in cities and took up agriculture. Townspeople fled to the steppes and adopted pastoral lifestyles. The interaction was constant and multifaceted. By the 7th century, the steppe corridor was fully integrated into the Silk Road system. Nomadic Khagans understood their role in international commerce and extracted value from it through protection fees, toll collection, and participation in trade. Sogdian merchants had perfected their intermediary role, creating commercial institutions that would influence Islamic and European trading practices centuries later. The steppe was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a highway to be utilized, dangerous but navigable, chaotic but ultimately manageable for those who understood its logic. The Tang Cosmopolis, the golden age of the Silk Road. The 7th and 8th centuries witnessed something extraordinary. Under the Tang Dynasty, the ancient roots achieved their zenith. Chang'an, the eastern terminus, became the largest city on Earth. Over 2 million souls lived within its walls and surrounding suburbs. But numbers alone don't capture what made this metropolis remarkable. Walk through its streets and you'd hear Persian merchants bargaining in their native tongue, Sogdian traders displaying silk from workshops thousands of miles away, Buddhist monks from India discussing scripture with Nestorian Christians from Syria, Zoroastrian priests maintaining their sacred fires. Census records indicate the city housed roughly 25,000 foreign residents. These weren't occasional visitors. They built temples, established trading houses, raised families. The capital maintained 9 different musical ensembles, each performing in distinct traditions from across Asia. Archaeological evidence shows instruments imported from Kucha, cymbals from India, drums fashioned in styles unknown to Chinese craftsmen. The Tang court practiced remarkable openness. Empress Wu Zetian and Emperor Xuanzong presided over an era when foreign religions flourished without persecution. The Xi'an stele, erected in 781, documents the presence of Nestorian Christianity. Zoroastrian and Manichaean temples operated openly. This wasn't mere tolerance. It reflected a cosmopolitan confidence, a civilization secure enough to welcome diversity. Tang military campaigns extended control far westward. By the early 8th century, Chinese authority reached as far as Herat in what would later become Afghanistan. The Protectorate General to pacify the West, established around 640, secured the Tarim Basin. Another protectorate governed the northern routes. These weren't just military installations, they facilitated commerce, maintained roads, protected caravans. Trade brought wealth. More importantly, it brought ideas. Paper-making techniques, already ancient in China, spread gradually westward. Porcelain from southern kilns became prized throughout Asia. Tea drinking evolved from medicinal practice to cultural phenomenon. The beverage that would eventually captivate the world found its first devoted following in Tang China. The capital's markets sold goods from 3 continents. Excavations reveal storage jars from Persia, glassware from Syria, textiles woven in patterns showing clear Central Asian influence. Tang nobles dressed in styles borrowed from the steppes. Women wore high boots, practical for riding. Foreign fashions became marks of sophistication. Tang sources report that roughly 25,000 foreigners lived within the capital, though such figures should be interpreted cautiously. Yet this golden age contained seeds of fragility. The An-Lushan Rebellion, beginning in 755, shattered the dynasty's control over Western territories. Tibetan forces seized key sections of the routes. Though cultural influence persisted, military dominance waned. The rebellion marked a turning point, though few recognized it at the time. Artists captured this cosmopolitan world. Tomb figurines show merchants with distinctly non-Chinese features. Painters depicted foreign ambassadors presenting tribute. These weren't curiosities, they were everyday realities in a city that stood at the crossroads of the known world. The Tang achievement wasn't simply connecting East and West. It was creating a space where diverse peoples could interact, trade, argue, learn from one another. For 2 centuries, Chang'an demonstrated what human civilization could become when walls came down and horizons expanded. The routes would never again reach quite this level of integration and openness. The Battle of Talas and the Paper Trail West. July 751. Along the Talas River, in territory that would one day become Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, two expanding empires collided. Tang forces under General Gao Xianji met the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate. The battle itself would prove less significant than what followed. The Tang had pushed westward, seeking to maintain control over the lucrative Central Asian trade networks. The Abbasids, consolidating power after overthrowing the Umayyads, pressed eastward. Both empires sought dominance over the same strategic region. When conflict erupted, it came swiftly. Accounts of troop numbers vary wildly. Tang sources claimed the Abbasid forces numbered 200,000. Arab sources put Tang strength at 100,000. Modern scholars suspect both figures inflated. What matters is this: the battle turned on betrayal. Karluk Turkish mercenaries fighting alongside the Tang switched sides mid-combat. Surrounded and outmaneuvered, Gao Xianji retreated eastward with a fraction of his men. The Tang never returned in force to Central Asia. The defeat marked the westernmost extent of Chinese expansion. Abbasid control over Transoxiana solidified. Yet the battle's true significance lay not in territorial change, but in an unintended consequence. Among the prisoners taken at Talas were Chinese craftsmen. Traditional accounts, recorded centuries later by historians like Al-Talibi, claim these captives introduced papermaking to Samarkand. Recent scholarship complicates this neat narrative. Archaeological evidence shows paper fragments in Central Asia predating 751. Sogdian letters written on paper existed decades, perhaps centuries earlier. Trade had already carried knowledge of papermaking westward, yet the battle likely accelerated the process. Even if paper production existed in rudimentary form, Chinese expertise refined and expanded it. Within decades, Samarkand became a major production center. From there, the technology spread throughout the Islamic world. Baghdad established paper mills by 794. Damascus followed. The cascade continued westward and southward. Paper revolutionized administration. Before its arrival, bureaucrats wrote on parchment, papyrus, or wooden tablets. Paper proved cheaper, more portable, easier to produce in quantity. Islamic scholarship flourished partly because paper made books more accessible. Libraries expanded. Knowledge circulated more freely. By the 10th century, paper had reached Muslim Spain. From there, it entered Christian Europe through trade and conquest. Italian merchants recognized its value. By the 13th century, European paper mills operated in Fabriano and elsewhere. The material that enabled Chinese bureaucracy for centuries became foundational to European Renaissance learning. The Battle of Talas changed little politically. The Tang faced internal rebellions that mattered far more than one lost engagement on the frontier. The Abbasids gained prestige but faced their own challenges. Both empires would weaken in coming decades. But that July day in 751 set in motion a technological transfer that reshaped human civilization. Every book printed in Europe, every document signed, every letter written owed something to the knowledge that traveled westward from that battlefield. Sometimes history's most profound changes emerge from what seem like footnotes. The Viking Silk Road, fur, silver, and the Volga trade route. Most imagine the Silk Road running east to west through Central Asia. Fewer consider the northern branch that connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world. Yet archaeological evidence tells a remarkable story. Thousands of Arab silver coins, dirhams minted in Baghdad and Samarkand, have been unearthed in Viking hoards throughout Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. These weren't isolated finds. They represent systematic trade networks that functioned from at least the 8th century onward. Scandinavian merchants, often called Russ, traveled down the great river systems of what would become Russia. The Volga route proved particularly important, flowing south toward the Caspian Sea and the territories controlled by the Abbasid Caliphate. What did Vikings offer? Furs commanded premium prices. Beaver, marten, fox, and particularly sable found eager buyers in the warm climates of the Islamic world. Amber from Baltic shores, rare and beautiful, traveled south. Honey, wax, weapons, and brutally human beings. The Viking slave trade supplied markets in Central Asia with captives taken during raids across Eastern Europe. In return, silver. The Abbasids minted dirhams in enormous quantities. These coins provided Vikings with a medium of exchange that held value across vast distances. They also brought back silk, spices, glassware, fine pottery, objects that conferred status in northern societies where such luxuries were otherwise unknown. In 921, the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir dispatched an embassy northward. The mission, led by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveled to the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had recently converted to Islam. Ibn Fadlan's account, preserved in fragments, provides the most detailed description we possess of the Rus. He found them fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Standing tall as palm trees, fair-haired and ruddy-complexioned, they struck him as physically impressive. But their habits appalled him. He described them as neglecting basic hygiene, engaging in public intimacy without modesty, worshipping crude wooden idols before trading. Yet Ibn Fadlan also documented their commercial sophistication. When Rus traders arrived at the Volga, they brought offerings to their gods, requesting success in trade. They sought merchants with many dirhams who would pay good prices without argument. The women wore silver and gold neck rings, their number indicating their husband's wealth. Each ring represented 10,000 dirhams accumulated. The Rus traded at permanent settlements along the river routes. Excavations at Staraya Ladoga and other sites show mixed populations of Scandinavians and Slavs engaged in commerce. These weren't temporary camps. They were trading centers that operated seasonally, connecting the Baltic world to the Caspian. The Northern Silk Road functioned differently from its southern cousin. Instead of camel caravans crossing deserts, goods moved by river in summer and overland in winter. Instead of oasis cities, trade occurred at fortified settlements and meeting grounds, but the principle remained the same, connecting distant economies through systematic exchange. This commerce shaped medieval Europe more than most realize. Silver from the Islamic world flowed into Scandinavia, fueling Viking expansion. The availability of portable wealth enabled raids and settlement across the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Economic historians argue that this silver influx helped transform Scandinavian societies from isolated tribal confederations into more complex political entities. The system faltered in the 11th century. Silver production in the Islamic world declined. New trade routes emerged, particularly the Dnieper route connecting Kiev to Constantinople. Viking nations converted to Christianity, making it awkward to sell Christian captives to Muslim markets. The Northern Silk Road faded, but for 2 centuries it functioned as a genuine transcontinental network. Scandinavian merchants in Baghdad, Arab dirhams in Swedish burial hoards. A Turkic-speaking people on the Volga serving as intermediaries between civilizations that barely knew of each other's existence. The routes connected more than anyone at the time fully understood. The Liao and Song dynasties, silk, tea, and the world's first paper money. After the Tang collapsed in 907, China fragmented, yet from this chaos emerged innovation. The Song dynasty, established in 960, presided over an economic revolution that transformed not just China but global commerce. The Song never controlled territory as extensive as the Tang. To the north, the Liao dynasty, established by the Khitan people, ruled vast territories including modern Beijing. To the northwest, the Western Xia commanded key sections of the routes. The Song purchased peace through massive annual payments of silver and silk. Treaties formalized what amounted to tribute, though diplomats called it something else. But military weakness masked economic strength. The Song period witnessed technological advances that historians compare to an early industrial revolution. Agricultural output soared. A new rice variety from Champa, maturing faster than traditional strains, enabled double cropping in southern regions. Population surged past 100 million. Iron production reached levels not seen again until 18th century Europe. By 1078, Chinese foundries produced roughly 125,000 tons annually. This wasn't decorative metalwork. It was industrial-scale production of tools, weapons, and agricultural implements. Maritime trade exploded. Song merchants sent ships to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, even East Africa. Shipwrights developed vessels with watertight bulkheads, stern-post rudders, and compass navigation. The largest junks carried hundreds of sailors and enormous cargo loads. Archaeological discoveries of Song ceramics in Zanzibar confirm the reach of these maritime networks. Porcelain became China's most famous export. Kilns at Jingdezhen employed thousands of workers, producing ceramics that commanded high prices across Asia and beyond. The city's output supplied both domestic markets and foreign trade. Chinese porcelain fragments have been found at archaeological sites from Japan to East Africa, testimony to its widespread appeal. Tea evolved from luxury to necessity. Plantations expanded threefold compared to Tang levels. The beverage became one of 7 essential household items. Tea houses dotted urban centers. Foreign demand, particularly from Central Asian peoples, made tea a major export commodity. Sichuan province devoted significant acreage to cultivation for the frontier trade. But the Song's most revolutionary innovation was paper money. Metal currency posed problems. Copper coins were heavy, making large transactions cumbersome. Iron coins, issued to prevent outflow to neighboring states, were even worse. In Sichuan, merchants developed paper certificates representing deposits of metal currency. These notes could be transferred, split, combined. The government recognized the potential. By the 11th century, official paper money circulated widely. This wasn't just convenience. It represented a fundamental shift in how societies conceptualized value. Money became information rather than material object. The implications would take centuries to fully unfold. Trade with the Liao and Western Xia, despite tensions, remained robust. Border markets operated under government supervision. Chinese goods flowed north: tea, silks, copper coins, porcelain, books, lacquerware, jewelry, rice, ginger, spices. The return trade brought silver horses, desperately needed for cavalry, camels, sheep, furs, precious gems, incense, fine cotton cloth from India and Persia. Horses particularly mattered. The Song military required thousands for cavalry forces. Domestic breeding proved inadequate. Northern powers understood this vulnerability and exploited it. The annual tribute included specified numbers of horses, often at extortionate prices. Urban culture flourished. By the 12th century, China possessed 52 large urban centers, each exceeding 100,000 households. Cities offered restaurants serving regional cuisines, tea shops, entertainment quarters, markets selling goods from across the known world. This represented something new, an urbanized, commercialized economy operating at scale. The Song period demonstrated that political fragmentation didn't preclude economic dynamism. Though unable to project military power effectively, the dynasty presided over innovations that shaped world history. Paper money, advanced ceramics, sophisticated maritime trade, industrial-scale iron production. These achievements occurred while the dynasty paid tribute to foreign powers and struggled to defend its borders. Economic strength, it turned out, sometimes mattered more than military conquest. The technological and commercial innovations of Song China would influence the world long after the dynasty itself disappeared. The Crusader Interlude: Spices, Stories, and a New Worldview. The First Crusade, launched in 1095, brought European warriors to the eastern Mediterranean. Ostensibly a religious war to reclaim Jerusalem, the Crusades had profound commercial consequences. They violently reconnected Western Europe with sophisticated trade networks that had functioned for centuries. Italian merchant republics seized the opportunity. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Amalfi, these city-states provided ships, supplies, and financial backing to crusading forces. In return, they demanded and received trading privileges in captured cities. Ports like Acre, Tyre, and Antioch became European outposts in Levantine territory. The Venetians proved particularly adept. By providing crucial naval support, they secured remarkable concessions from Byzantine emperors and crusader states alike. The Golden Bull of 1082, issued by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, granted Venetian merchants duty-free trading rights throughout Byzantine territories. This exemption from taxes provided enormous competitive advantage. After the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, Venice gained even more. The city acquired substantial territory, including Crete and other strategic islands. More importantly, it dominated maritime trade between Europe and the Levant. For nearly a century, Venetian galleys controlled the most lucrative routes, carrying spices, silk, and luxury goods to European markets. Genoa competed fiercely. Wars between these rival republics punctuated the 13th and 14th centuries. They fought over trading privileges, colonial possessions, and market access. The competition spurred innovation in shipbuilding, navigation, and commercial organization. Both cities developed sophisticated banking systems, marine insurance, and bills of exchange. What did Europe import? Spices topped the list. Pepper, the most valuable, commanded prices that made fortunes. Cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cardamom, these weren't just seasonings. They were medicines, preservatives, symbols of wealth. Medieval European cuisine for the wealthy incorporated spices in quantities that would seem excessive today. Sugar arrived as a rare luxury. Crusaders encountered sugarcane cultivation in Levantine territories and learned processing techniques from Arab and local populations. Some established plantations in conquered areas. The sweet substance gradually became more available, though it remained expensive until much later. Silk, always prized, flowed westward. Textiles from Damascus, Baghdad, and beyond found eager buyers among European nobility. Cotton cloth from India and Persia introduced new fabrics. Dyes, particularly the deep red from kermes insects, became valuable commodities. Glassware from Syria, ceramics, carpets, leather goods from various regions. The Crusades also transmitted knowledge. European scholars encountered Arabic translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts lost to the West. These works, along with original Arabic scholarship in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, gradually made their way to European universities. The transmission would contribute to intellectual transformations centuries later. Architecture showed influence. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, decorative motifs, elements that would characterize Gothic style appeared in structures built by crusaders. Whether these represented genuine innovation or adaptation of existing Middle Eastern techniques remains debated. But the connection seems clear. The violence shouldn't be minimized. The Crusades involved massacres, forced conversions, and destruction of communities that had coexisted for centuries. Jewish populations suffered particularly both in the Levant and in Europe as crusading fervor turned against them. The legacy includes deep scars in interfaith relations. Yet commerce persisted even during hostilities. Muslim and Christian merchants continued trading, often with approval from their respective authorities. Truce periods enabled commercial contact. The Italian merchant republics maintained relations with both sides, pragmatically pursuing profit regardless of religious allegiance. The Crusader presence in the Levant ended with the fall of Acre in 1291. European outposts disappeared. But the commercial networks remained. Italian merchants continued trading through Alexandria, Constantinople, and other ports. They'd learned that vast profits awaited those who could connect Asian supply with European demand. The Crusades fundamentally altered European understanding of the world. Before, the East existed as legend and rumor. After, thousands had traveled there, seen sophisticated cities, encountered complex civilizations. The experience whetted European appetite for luxury goods and created commercial expertise that would prove crucial in centuries ahead. The routes, always adaptable, absorbed yet another group of traders. Venetian and Genoese merchants joined Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, and others in the vast network connecting Asia to Europe. The Crusades had opened European eyes. What came next would reshape the world. The Mongol world system. The Pax Mongolica and its travelers. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but his descendants continued building. By mid-century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. This vast domain, larger than any before, operated under unified administration. The result, termed Pax Mongolica by historians, made the routes safer than they'd been in centuries. The Mongols imposed order ruthlessly, but once conquest ended, they protected trade with equal determination. Robbery on the roads invited severe punishment. If merchants suffered losses, local authorities compensated them double and paid the Khan 5 times the value. This policy transformed regional rulers into invested guardians of commercial traffic. The postal system, called Yam, created unprecedented communication speed. Relay stations, spaced roughly a day's ride apart, stretched across the empire. Couriers carrying official passes could exchange tired horses for fresh mounts, receive food and shelter, demand assistance. Messages traveled from China to Persia in weeks rather than months. Merchants benefited directly. With proper documentation, traders could traverse the entire empire under Mongol protection. No longer did caravans face multiple jurisdictions, each demanding different tolls and offering uncertain security. One law, one currency system, one administration oversaw the roads. Europeans took notice. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV sent Giovanni da Pian del Carpine eastward to gather intelligence about the Mongols. The Franciscan friar reached Karakorum, the capital, and returned with detailed observations. His report, though aimed at assessing military threat, revealed the possibility of contact. William of Rubruck followed in 1253, dispatched by King Louis X of France. His account described peoples, customs, and geography previously unknown to European audiences. More importantly, it demonstrated that Europeans could travel safely across Asia under Mongol rule. The routes were open. Then came the Polos. Niccolo and Maffeo, Venetian merchants, journeyed east in the 1260s and reached the court of Kublai Khan. They returned to Venice in 1269 with messages for the Pope. In 1271, they departed again, this time bringing Niccolo's 17-year-old son, Marco. Marco Polo's subsequent account would become medieval Europe's most influential travel narrative. Whether he reached everywhere he claimed remains debated. Historians note curious omissions: no mention of tea, the Great Wall barely referenced, chopsticks unmentioned. Some argue he compiled reports rather than witnessing everything personally, yet the core narrative holds. Polo spent years in Mongol service, traveling throughout the empire. His descriptions of China's wealth, vast cities, sophisticated administration, and advanced technology astonished European readers. The book, dictated to a writer of romance, while Polo was imprisoned after a sea battle, combined factual observation with embellishment aimed at entertaining audiences. It worked. Copies circulated widely. Columbus carried a version on his westward voyage, margins filled with notes. The book expanded European geographic imagination. China existed not as myth, but as destination. The wealth Polo described set merchants dreaming. The Mongols, often portrayed as destroyers, facilitated remarkable cultural exchange. Chinese techniques spread westward. Gunpowder weapons, though invented earlier, proliferated. Playing cards, a Chinese innovation, appeared in Europe. Printing technology drew attention, though Europeans wouldn't fully adopt it for another century. Westward knowledge also flowed. Persian astronomical techniques influenced Chinese science. Kublai Khan employed a diverse staff of advisors, including Muslims from Central Asia who brought their expertise. The observatory he built in Beijing utilized instruments and methods from multiple traditions. Religious exchange flourished. Nestorian Christianity, strong in Central Asia, found protection under Mongol rule. Buddhist missionaries traveled freely. Islam spread in conquered territories, though Mongol rulers remained pragmatic about faith, often practicing traditional shamanism while tolerating other religions. The system functioned through a combination of military might and commercial pragmatism. The Mongols understood that prosperous subjects paid better taxes. They invested in infrastructure, maintained roads, protected merchants. Their postal system, originally military, became commercial lifeline. But the Pax Mongolica contained inherent fragility. It depended on unified leadership and effective communication across enormous distances. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the empire fragmented. Different khanates pursued divergent interests. The Golden Horde controlled Russia, the Ilkhanate held Persia, the Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia, the Yuan Dynasty governed China. They remained nominally connected, but unity eroded. By the mid-14th century, the system was failing. Civil wars, succession disputes, economic disruption. The routes remained, but safety declined. The window of opportunity that had enabled European travelers to reach China began closing. The Pax Mongolica lasted roughly a century. In that time, it demonstrated what unified administration across Eurasia could achieve. Knowledge, goods, and people moved with unprecedented freedom. The world grew smaller, more connected. When the system collapsed, that connection fractured. But the memory remained, and with it, the understanding that East and West could be bridged. The Black Death, the highway of pandemic. The routes carried more than goods and ideas. They transmitted disease. The plague that struck in the mid-14th century traveled the same roads that had enriched cities for centuries. The pandemic revealed the dark side of connectivity. Scientific consensus, based on genetic studies, traces the pathogen to Central Asian rodent populations. The bacterium Yersinia pestis lived in various species, possibly gerbils, marmots, other burrowing animals. Normally, it circulated among these hosts, transmitted by fleas, causing occasional localized outbreaks. Climate shifts in the 14th century may have disrupted this equilibrium. Environmental stress caused rodent population crashes. Fleas, losing their hosts, sought new sources of blood. They found them in the horses, camels, and humans traveling the trade routes. Once established in human populations, the disease spread through multiple pathways: infected fleas, respiratory transmission, contaminated materials. By 1346, plague reached the Crimean port of Kaffa. Genoa's merchants maintained a trading station there, a vital link in their Black Sea commerce. The city came under siege by Mongol forces. According to chroniclers, plague broke out among the besiegers. Some accounts claim the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the walls, though this detail may be later embellishment. Whether deliberately or not, plague entered Kaffa. When the siege lifted, Genoa's merchants fled by ship. They carried the disease westward. Constantinople, Athens, Sicily, Venice, Genoa, port after port received infected ships. By 1347, the plague had established itself throughout the Mediterranean. From ports, it spread inland. Trade routes again served as vectors. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, refugees, all unknowingly carried infection. The disease moved along roads that had carried silk and spices for centuries. Rivers served as highways for contagion. Cities, dense with population, became incubators. Europe suffered catastrophically. Estimates suggest 30 to 60% of the population perished between 1347 and 1353. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost half their inhabitants or more. The death toll probably exceeded 50 million. Some regions lost two-thirds of their people. Asia experienced similar devastation. Records are less complete, but evidence suggests massive mortality. 25 million died across Asia and North Africa. China's population, already stressed by famines and warfare, plummeted. The Mongol Empire, weakened by internal division, fractured further as plague claimed leaders and disrupted administration. The disease struck without discrimination. Pope Clement VI's physician, Guy de Chauliac, described symptoms: sudden fever, swollen lymph nodes in groin or armpit, dark discoloration of tissue. These buboes gave the disease its name. Victims often died within days of symptom onset. Pneumonic plague, transmitted through respiratory droplets, worked even faster. Contemporary observers struggled to explain the catastrophe. They cited astrological conjunctions, earthquakes, corrupted air, divine punishment for sin. Jews faced accusations of poisoning wells despite dying in equal proportion. Massacres occurred. Flagellants whipped themselves in processions, seeking divine mercy through suffering. None of it helped. The actual cause, bacterial infection transmitted by fleas and respiratory contact, lay beyond 14th century understanding. Without effective treatment, population centers became unliving grounds. The common advice was to flee quickly, return slowly, if at all. Those who could leave did. Economic consequences proved enormous. Labor became scarce. Survivors could demand higher wages. Traditional social hierarchies weakened. Landowners, unable to find workers, offered better terms. Serfdom loosened in many regions. Women gained property rights they'd lacked before. The plague, paradoxically, improved conditions for survivors. But recovery took generations. Some regions didn't regain pre-plague population levels until the 16th century. Whole villages remained abandoned. Agricultural land reverted to wilderness. Trade networks, though resilient, operated at reduced scale. The vibrant commerce of the Pax Mongolica never fully returned. The plague recurred periodically. It had established itself in rodent populations across Eurasia and North Africa. Every 20 years or so, new outbreaks struck. Europeans learned to implement quarantines, plague hospitals, border controls. These public health measures, primitive by modern standards, offered some protection, but the disease persisted. The Black Death demonstrated that interconnectedness carried risks alongside benefits. The routes that had enabled cultural exchange and economic prosperity also enabled rapid disease transmission. Dense populations in urban centers, frequent contact between distant regions, extensive trade networks, all factors that promoted civilization also accelerated pandemic spread. The irony was bitter. The Mongols had created a system enabling unprecedented safe travel across Eurasia. That same system carried plague from its Central Asian reservoir to every corner of the connected world. The routes meant to unite civilizations became highways for death. The lesson would not be learned. Human desire for connection, commerce, and contact would always outweigh caution. The routes would rebuild, trade would resume, and with it, the risk of future pandemics. Tamerlane's fury, the last great nomad and the scourge of Samarkand. By the late 14th century, the Mongol Empire had fragmented. Its successor states struggled with internal conflicts and external pressures. Into this power vacuum stepped Timur, known to history as Tamerlane. Born around 1336 near Samarkand, he rose through cunning, military genius, and exceptional brutality. Timur claimed descent from Genghis Khan, though the connection was tenuous. To strengthen his legitimacy, he married into Chinggisid lineage. By 1370, he controlled Transoxiana and established his capital at Samarkand. What followed was 3 decades of nearly constant campaigning. His armies swept across Persia, subduing cities through terror as much as tactical skill. Resistance invited horrific retaliation. Contemporary accounts, likely exaggerated, describe towers built from the skulls of the defeated. When the city of Isfahan revolted after initially surrendering, chroniclers claim Timur's forces eliminated 70,000 inhabitants. Whether these numbers reflect reality or propagandistic inflation remains unclear. Similar fates reportedly befell other cities foolish enough to resist. In 1395, he turned north against the Golden Horde, sacking the cities that controlled northern Silk Road routes. Astrakhan and Sarai Berke were destroyed utterly. This wasn't strategic necessity. Timur wanted the trade routes running through his capital, not competing centers. The northern routes never recovered. Delhi fell in 1398. Timur invaded the Sultanate under the pretext that its Muslim rulers showed excessive tolerance toward Hindu subjects. His army crossed into India, destroyed the Sultanate's forces at Panipat, and reduced Delhi to ruins. Contemporary chronicles report 90 captured elephants hauling stones back to Samarkand to build mosques. In 1402, he defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara. The Ottomans, ascendant in Anatolia, suddenly faced existential crisis. Bayezid died in captivity. Timur's intervention delayed Ottoman expansion by decades, inadvertently extending Byzantine Constantinople's life. Yet, Timur's legacy extended beyond destruction. He understood that empire required more than military might. While his armies spread terror, he simultaneously ordered forced relocations of skilled artisans, scholars, and craftsmen to Samarkand. Conquered cities lost their educated classes, who were compelled to settle in the Timurid capital. The Spanish ambassador Ruy González de Clavijo, who visited Samarkand in 1404, left detailed descriptions. The city bustled with commerce. Goods arrived from across Asia: Chinese silk and porcelain, Indian textiles, Persian metalwork, Russian furs. Workshops produced items for local consumption and export. Streets filled with merchants speaking dozens of languages. Timur invested heavily in architecture. Samarkand's great structures, mosques, madras, tombs, date from this period. The Gure Amir, his eventual mausoleum, exemplifies Timurid architectural achievement. Its ribbed azure dome, intricate tile work, and harmonious proportions influenced later Islamic architecture, including the great Mughal monuments of India. Chinese influence appeared everywhere. Diplomatic missions from Ming China brought porcelain, silk, and craftsmen. Timur coveted Chinese goods and techniques. His workshops produced ceramics imitating Chinese blue and white porcelain. Textiles incorporated motifs borrowed from Chinese designs. The cultural exchange flowed both ways along routes Timur controlled. But the conqueror remained restless. In 1405, at age 68, he launched an audacious campaign to invade Ming China. The plan was absurd, attacking the most populous empire on earth across difficult terrain in winter. Timur didn't care. His ambition knew no bounds. He died en route near Otrar in modern Kazakhstan, felled by pneumonia. His body returned to Samarkand for burial in the Gure Amir. The empire he'd built fragmented immediately. Sons and grandsons carved out separate domains. They lacked his military genius and ruthless drive, yet the Timurid cultural legacy endured. His grandson Ulugh Beg, ruling from Samarkand, became a distinguished astronomer. The observatory Ulugh Beg built produced astronomical tables of remarkable accuracy. Not until the invention of the telescope would European measurements surpass them. Herat, under Timurid rule, became a center of Persian miniature painting and literature. The traditions developed there influenced artistic production across the Islamic world. Timurid architectural styles spread to Persia, Central Asia, and eventually Mughal India. The Taj Mahal's design owes debt to precedents established in Samarkand. Timur's descendants established the Mughal Empire in India. Babur, the first Mughal emperor, traced direct lineage to Tamerlane. The Mughals never forgot Samarkand. Emperor Jahangir, ruling in the 1620s, inquired about the Gur Emir's condition and offered to fund its maintenance. The ancestral capital retained symbolic importance generations later. Historians debate Timur's place in history. Some see him as the last great nomadic conqueror, a throwback attempting to recreate Mongol glory through sheer violence. Others note the cultural flowering his patronage enabled. Both assessments hold truth. He was brutal beyond measure. His campaigns ended millions of lives. Cities that resisted faced obliteration. The terror he spread was calculated and effective. But he also understood that lasting empire required more than fear. He built, patronized, created. Samarkand under Timur became one of Asia's great cities, a crossroads where cultures met and mingled. The paradox of Timur reflects the paradox of the routes themselves. Violence and culture, destruction and creation existed simultaneously. The same roads that brought merchants carried armies. The same skills that built monuments also constructed siege engines. The routes never offered pure benefits or pure costs. They reflected human civilization in all its complexity, inspiring and horrifying in equal measure. The age of discovery, seas of change, and the roads decline. By the 15th century, the overland routes faced multiple challenges. The Ming Dynasty, established in 1368 after expelling Mongol rule, adopted a different approach to foreign relations. Where the Yuan had embraced international trade, the Ming initially turned inward. While maritime expeditions under Admiral Zheng He reached as far as East Africa in the early 1400s, these missions ended abruptly. The empire focused on internal consolidation rather than external engagement. To the west, the Ottoman Empire expanded steadily. Constantinople fell in 1453, ending 11 centuries of Byzantine rule. The Ottomans controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and increasingly the land routes through Anatolia and Syria. While they didn't close these routes, tariff revenues mattered too much. They controlled them completely. European merchants faced higher costs and reduced access. Meanwhile, European states sought alternatives. The Italian merchant republics had profited immensely from their position as intermediaries. But dependence on others rankled. If trade with Asia generated such wealth, why not establish direct connections? Portugal moved first. Prince Henry, later called the Navigator, sponsored systematic exploration of the African coast beginning in the 1410s. Each voyage pushed a bit farther south. Captains learned wind patterns, currents, navigation techniques. The motivation combined religion, glory, and profit. Finding a route to the spice sources would break the Venetian-Ottoman monopoly. In 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip. The route to India lay open. A decade later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey. In 1498, his ships reached Calicut on India's southwestern coast. The Portuguese had done it, established direct maritime contact with Asian markets. The implications became clear quickly. Sea transport, while risky, proved cheaper than overland caravans for bulk goods. A ship could carry far more cargo than any camel train. Once routes were established, costs dropped dramatically. The economics transformed. Portuguese and later Spanish, Dutch, and English ships began regular voyages to Asia. They established trading posts, made agreements with local rulers, sometimes conquered territory outright. The age of European colonial expansion had begun, though few recognized it immediately. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 shifted attention westward. Spanish conquistadors found vast wealth in Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations. Silver from Potosi and other New World mines flooded the global economy. The transatlantic trade eventually exceeded the Transasian trade in value. The overland Silk Road didn't cease functioning overnight. Trade continued, though at reduced scale. Merchants still traveled the routes. Caravans still crossed Central Asian deserts. But the Golden Age had passed. The future lay with maritime commerce. Several factors drove this transition. Technology mattered. European shipbuilders developed vessels capable of long ocean voyages. Navigation instruments improved. Cartography became more accurate. Knowledge accumulated with each successful voyage. Economics proved decisive. Sea routes simply cost less per unit of goods transported. The difference became stark for bulk commodities. Spices, the most valuable goods by weight, could profitably travel either way. But for everything else, textiles, metals, ceramics, maritime transport held clear advantage. Political changes contributed. The fragmented nature of overland routes meant dealing with multiple authorities. Each demanded payment, offered varying levels of security, imposed different regulations. Maritime routes, while not without risks, simplified logistics. A merchant needed agreements in departure and destination ports, but the ocean between required no negotiations. The Ming turn inward proved significant. China had been the ultimate destination for much westward trade and the source of silk, porcelain, and tea. When Ming emperors restricted foreign trade and contact, they reduced the pull that had drawn merchants eastward for centuries. Japan, previously open, also adopted isolationist policies under the Tokugawa shogunate. Central Asian political instability didn't help. Without strong empires guaranteeing security, the routes became more dangerous. Banditry increased. The infrastructure that Mongol rule had maintained, roads, way stations, postal systems, deteriorated. Travel became harder, riskier, less profitable. Climate change played a role scholars are still assessing. The Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300 and intensifying in the 1500s, brought harsher weather to Central Asia and Europe. Colder temperatures affected agriculture, trade patterns, and the viability of some routes. The decline wasn't uniform. Some sections thrived while others withered. The maritime routes didn't replace overland trade entirely, but supplemented and eventually surpassed it. Regional networks persisted. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Kashgar remained commercial centers, though their global significance diminished. By 1600, the transformation was complete. Europeans controlled the most profitable trade routes to Asia. They'd established colonial outposts, defeated local navies, carved out spheres of influence. The ancient land routes still existed, but operated in the shadow of maritime commerce. The shift carried profound consequences. Wealth and power tilted toward Atlantic-facing nations. European states, enriched by Asian and American trade, began their long ascendancy. Asian empires, while often still powerful regionally, found themselves increasingly marginalized in global commerce. The Silk Road, as a primary conduit of global trade, had ended. What had functioned for nearly 2 millennia, connecting civilizations and enabling exchange, gave way to new systems. The routes didn't disappear. People still traveled them, goods still moved, but their world-shaping importance faded. Yet the legacy endured. The routes had connected humanity in ways that shaped every subsequent age. Technologies, religions, artistic traditions, agricultural crops, diseases, all had traveled those roads. The world Europeans discovered and began dominating had been shaped by centuries of Silk Road exchange. The connections forged across those ancient paths created the preconditions for the global system that emerged. The end of the Silk Road as a primary trade network marked a turning point. An era closed. But what those routes had accomplished, the demonstration that distant civilizations could connect, trade, learn from one another, that lesson persisted. The future would build on foundations laid by caravans crossing deserts and mountains, merchants bartering in oasis cities, ideas flowing along dusty roads. The routes themselves might decline, but their impact would shape human civilization forever. The legacy unearthed, archaeology, the new Silk Road, and a connected past. For centuries after the routes faded, they existed primarily as legend. Marco Polo's account remained popular, but many doubted its veracity. The ancient cities, buried under sand or rubble, awaited rediscovery. That process began in the 19th century and continues today. The Great Game, the strategic competition between Britain and Russia for influence in Central Asia, brought the first modern explorers. Military officers, diplomats, and spies traveled disguised as merchants, pilgrims, or scholars. They mapped territory, assessed resources, gathered intelligence. Some also pursued genuine archaeological interest. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist, conducted multiple expeditions in the early 20th century. Starting in 1900, he traveled through Xinjiang, documenting ruins and excavating sites. His most famous discovery came at Dunhuang in 1907. In the Mogao Caves, a Buddhist monk revealed a sealed chamber containing thousands of manuscripts and paintings, some dating back over a millennium. Stein acquired, or depending on perspective, pillaged tens of thousands of documents. These texts, written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and other languages, provided unprecedented insight into Silk Road societies. Religious texts, government documents, private letters, commercial records. The Dunhuang manuscripts transformed scholarly understanding of Central Asian history. Sven Hedin, a Swedish explorer, made similar contributions. Between 1890 and 1935, he led 4 expeditions through Central Asia, mapping previously unknown territory and locating lost cities. His accounts brought scholarly and public attention to regions that had been largely forgotten. Paul Pelliot, a French sinologist, visited Dunhuang in 1908, shortly after Stein. He also acquired thousands of documents. Pelliot, fluent in multiple Asian languages, made selections based on content rather than volume. His choices often proved more valuable for specific research than Stein's bulk acquisitions. These early expeditions sparked controversy. Critics accused Europeans of looting cultural heritage. Defenders argued they preserved materials that might otherwise have been destroyed or dispersed. The debate continues. Many source countries now demand return of artifacts taken during this period. Museums housing these collections face difficult questions about ownership and access, but the materials themselves proved invaluable. The Dunhuang manuscripts enabled reconstruction of Silk Road trade networks, religious transmission, linguistic development, and daily life. Letters between merchants revealed business practices. Government documents showed administrative systems. Religious texts traced the spread of Buddhism, Manichaeism, Nestorianism, and other faiths. Archaeological work expanded dramatically in the late 20th century. Chinese, Japanese, European, and American scholars conducted systematic excavations at dozens of sites. Improved techniques, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, chemical analysis of artifacts provided new insights. The Tarim mummies discovered in Xinjiang's Tarim Basin astonished researchers. These naturally preserved bodies, some dating back nearly 4,000 years, showed physical features more common in Europe or West Asia than East Asia. DNA analysis revealed mixed ancestry. These weren't Chinese, nor were they simply Iranian or European. They represented populations that migrated, mixed, and settled in Central Asia long before the historical Silk Road period. The mummies wore woolen textiles showing sophisticated weaving techniques. Their grave goods included wheat, millet, and other crops. Chemical analysis of their remains revealed diets heavy in protein and dairy, consistent with pastoral lifeways. Everything about them challenged simplistic notions of ancient populations as isolated and static. Modern excavations revealed the scale of ancient cities. At Merv in Turkmenistan, archaeologists uncovered a massive urban center that had thrived for over 2 millennia. Systematic surveys using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar revealed irrigation systems, building layouts, and fortifications invisible from ground level. Shipwrecks provided maritime perspectives. The Belitung shipwreck, discovered off Indonesia, contained over 60,000 pieces of Tang Dynasty ceramics, plus gold and silver items. Dated to around 826, this 9th century Arab dhow had loaded cargo in southern Chinese ports bound for the Middle East. Its preservation offered direct evidence of the maritime Silk Road operating in parallel with overland routes. Contemporary interest surged with China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013. This massive infrastructure project explicitly invokes Silk Road legacy. While modern in execution, high-speed rail, pipelines, ports, it follows ancient routes in connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The initiative sparked renewed archaeological and historical research. Governments along the routes, recognizing tourism potential, invested in preserving and restoring historic sites. UNESCO designated multiple Silk Road locations as World Heritage Sites. Public awareness increased dramatically. Modern genetic studies revealed human migration patterns. Analysis of DNA from ancient remains and contemporary populations showed how peoples moved and mixed along the routes. The Silk Road wasn't just commercial network, but also corridor for human genetic exchange. Modern Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and East Asian populations carry signatures of these ancient connections. Studies of crops and animals confirmed biological exchange. Wheat, originating in the Fertile Crescent, reached China via the routes. Rice moved westward. Grapes, originally domesticated in the Caucasus or nearby regions, spread across Eurasia. Horses, crucial to Silk Road commerce, showed genetic mixing from Central Asian domestication centers to East Asian and European populations. Linguistic research traced how words traveled. The English word peach derives ultimately from Persian. Tea came from Chinese, though two different pronunciations traveled different routes, giving us tea in English and chai in Russian. Religious terminology moved across linguistic boundaries as faith spread. The archaeological record confirms the scale of technological exchange. Chinese silk in Egyptian tombs from Roman times, Chinese porcelain in East African settlements, Roman glassware in Japanese imperial collections. Each object represents a journey of thousands of miles, changing hands multiple times, testimony to networks connecting distant regions. What emerges from a century of archaeological research is a picture of remarkable connectivity. The ancient world wasn't a collection of isolated civilizations, but interconnected system. Ideas, goods, diseases, people moved constantly. Cultures influenced one another continuously. The Silk Road legacy matters today not as nostalgia, but as demonstration of what human societies can achieve. For nearly 2 millennia, these routes enabled exchange despite formidable obstacles. Different religions, languages, political systems all coexisted within commercial framework, emphasizing mutual benefit. Conflicts occurred, certainly. Violence marked much of the history. But commerce persisted. Connections endured. Modern globalization, with its instant communication and rapid transport, seems unprecedented. In some ways, it is. But the fundamental pattern, distant societies connecting through trade, exchanging ideas alongside goods, adapting and adopting from one another, that's ancient. The Silk Road demonstrated principles that remain relevant. As archaeological work continues, new discoveries add detail to our understanding. Each excavation, each analysis of artifacts, each genetic study reveals more about how ancient peoples connected. The routes may have declined as commercial arteries, but as object of study and source of lessons, they've never been more vital. The Silk Road wasn't simply trade route. It was system enabling civilizations to interact, learn from one another, and collectively advance. That legacy, preserved in manuscripts, ruins, and genetic codes, offers perspective on our own interconnected age. The challenges we face, managing global exchange, balancing local and universal values, responding to shared threats, these aren't new. The routes grappled with similar issues across centuries. By studying that history, excavating its remains, analyzing its impacts, we gain insight into enduring questions about human connection. The Silk Road demonstrates both the possibilities and perils of linking distant societies. Understanding that past helps navigate our connected present and shape our collaborative future. The ancient routes, though faded from maps, remain vital pathways through human history.